Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee. We're back for fiscal year 2022 budget hearings. Before we get started, I'm going to ask everyone on the call, please turn your cameras on. That's everyone with the exception of Mayor's Office of Government Relations and Council President staff. Everyone else, including council members, please turn your cameras on. And that also includes BBMR. You don't have to turn your cameras on. But anyone with the agency, with BPD, anyone on the council? All right. Excellent. Okay, this is the Ways and Means Committee. We're here for City Council Ordinance 21-0080. The ordinance of estimates for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. I'm Eric Costello, councilman from the 11th District and chair of the committee. I am joined in chambers by vice chairs, Councilwoman Danny McCray, 2nd District, member of the committee, Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer, 5th District, member of the committee. Also joining us at City Hall is Council President Nick Mosby. Members of the committee with us this evening, we have Councilman Chris Burnett, 8th District, member of the committee. Councilman Ryan Dorsey, 3rd District, member of the committee. Council Vice President Sharon Middleton, 6th District, member of the committee. And Councilman Robert Stokes, 12th District, member of the committee. Also joining us virtually, Councilman James Torrance, 7th District, Councilman Mark Conway, 4th District, Councilman Z. Cohen, 1st District, Councilwoman Odette Ramos, 14th District. Joining us on behalf of Mayor Brandon Scott is Natasha Mihu and Nina Themelis. Joining us on behalf of Council President Nick Mosby is Matt Stegman and Nikki Thompson. Marguerite Curran, is staff to the committee and is here with us as well. We're here for the Baltimore Police Department. This is the last agency of Budget Week. We're also joined by Deputy Mayor for Public Safety, Sonny Schnitzer. I think that's all we've got from the administration. What we're going to do tonight, we're going to start off with a presentation from the police department. My understanding is we're going to start with Police Commissioner Michael Harrison. Then we're going to jump to Director of Finance, Henry Raymond, who's here in chambers with us. We will then go back to Police Commissioner Michael Harrison, and we will close out with City Solicitor Jim Shea. We're going to give the police department 30 minutes to do their introductory presentation. After we get through that presentation, we will then jump to council member questions. Couple quick points of order. Please make sure that your microphone is on mute unless you are recognized by the chair and are talking. When you're done talking, please turn your microphone off. Please keep your video on for the duration of the hearing. There's a lot of folks that are probably watching this from home, and it's important that they understand our shared interest and priority here in Baltimore's police department and specifically their budget. When we get to council members for their questions, we are going to strictly adhere to the 2-question rule. That's going to go across the board. And we are not going to make speeches tonight. We all understand why we were here. We understand that folks from the police department understand the issues as we understand them. And our role tonight is to ask direct questions and to get direct answers from our police department to those questions. We've also been joined by City Administrator Chris Shorter. So with that, Commissioner Harrison, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, and good evening, Council President Mosby. Can everybody hear me? Good evening, Council President Mosby, Council Vice President Middleton, Chairman Costello, and honorable members of the City Council. Thank you for the opportunity to present the Baltimore Police Department's fiscal year 2022 budget this evening. I'm joined by members of my executive team and will forego their introductions for the sake of time this evening. Now, you have heard me say many times before that good policing is about three things: building new relationships that were never built, improving good relationships, and repairing broken relationships. This is a fundamental governing philosophy of mine. And when I talk about relationships, first and foremost, I mean the community at large, but that certainly also includes you, our elected representatives of the community. And I believe we have developed a good relationship with each other over the course of our respective terms. I strive to be as open, transparent, and accessible as possible. Every one of you has my cell number. Some of you use it more than others. My executive team and I are intentional about keeping you informed and being as responsive as possible to your requests, your data inquiries, and to specific issues affecting your districts. We've created the most transparent police department this city has seen in ages. That is not to say that we've not fallen short at times, though when things are brought to my attention, we always try to course correct moving forward. With that said, my team and I collectively work very hard to maintain a good rapport with you all. It may not always have been that way historically, but it is policy in my office, and I do so we can have that trust between us and have an honest and direct dialogue with one another, both in private and in this public forum, about the challenges we face, the constraints we must work within, and the opportunities for reform that we can achieve together. To that end, I'm going to start off this evening by giving a very broad overview of the BPD's budget, and then I'll briefly hand it off to Director Raymond, who will discuss some of the cost drivers in more detail. BPD's general fund budget is nearly $522 million. This is more than a $21 million or a 4% increase from fiscal year 21. But context is going to be key here in these numbers. First, there is a current level service budget, meaning that there are no new enhancements or new initiatives beyond what was provided last year. The increases that you see are due to rising fixed costs, some referred to as mandatory or non-discretionary spending, specifically pension contributions, healthcare benefits, and workman's compensation costs. These represent obligations that the city has made for its employees, and we must, meaning we are legally, not to mention morally, obligated to honor them. While included in BPD's budget, I have no direct control over these costs. Some actuary, someplace, comes up with a number which simply becomes a cost that is charged to our budget. In fact, nearly a third of BPD's budget includes these items. $110 million alone are the legacy costs for our pension contributions. $40 million are the costs for our health care benefits, and over $30 million are the costs for our workman's compensation. Second, these fixed costs rose for the BPD much the same way they rose for every other city agency. BPD's general fund budget rose by around the same percentage as did the city's entire general fund budget. Another way to illustrate this point is that this year's BPD's share of the city's general fund was 26%. BPD's share for this upcoming year is 26%. Despite the increases not in fixed costs, our share has not changed. Third, with respect to the portion of BPD's budget that I do have control over, I believe that we've demonstrated good management and fiscal stewardship over the tax dollars of which we are entrusted. We've worked diligently to put into place responsible policies and rigorous oversight to constrain the department's overtime spending considerably over the last 2 years, and we're seeing results. In fiscal year 19, we spent $51 million in overtime. In fiscal year 20, we spent $44 million in overtime, and in fiscal year 21, we're projected to end the year with around $33 million in overtime spending. This is over an $18 million swing in the 2 years, or a 36% decrease from when I first arrived. This kind of reduction is historic for our agency, and we achieved these goals because we focused just as much on what we were spending the overtime for as we are on how much we were spending. Our goals and objectives must be clearly defined before supervisory approval is granted or the dollar is spent. which enhances accountability and ensures that we are getting the most out of any overtime authorized. These savings are in addition to the nearly $13 million worth of cuts and efficiencies that we ourselves made last year as part of our combined efforts toward closing the city's budget deficit and future obligations toward Kerwin. This is on top of the additional cuts that were enacted by the City Council during the budget process. In total, these cuts, cost reductions, and savings amount to $40 million over the last 2 years. These are the numbers, and I believe that they demonstrate our commitment to run this department responsibly and efficiently. But given the relationship that I mentioned earlier and our ability to be honest and direct with one another, I need to give you my candid assessment of the situation and to share my genuine concern of the unintended consequences of further reductions to our budget. From an operational standpoint, additional budget cuts will translate into one or a combination of the following: a reduction of the size of necessary specialized units like homicide, sex offense, or internal affairs in order to staff patrol, which we are contractually obligated to staff to a prescribed number, all of which would negatively impact investigations and our case closure rates. Longer response times for emergency calls, deprioritizing and particular calls for service and or unmanned patrol posts during times of higher call volume. Now, when I talk about negative impacts on investigations and case closure rates, this is not some abstract idea. It means that it will hinder our ability to hold accountable murderers, sexual predators, and those officers who commit misconduct, which could be anything from excessive force complaints to when an officer posts an offensive or disturbing social media post, as we saw over the weekend. When I talk about longer response times for emergency calls, I mean having to adjust our performance goal from 10-minute responses to something unacceptably higher. When I talk about deprioritizing calls for service or unmanned posts, I mean that burglaries or simple robberies could be put in the queue waiting for available units. This also means that fewer resources for special deployments that would require a robust police presence that's needed to prevent or deter violent acts or other crimes. Any one of those operational changes, bad enough as they are, would also mean falling out of compliance with the mandates related to the court-approved staffing plan, and thus the consent decree itself, which then brings about legal challenges and consequences. These consequences are real, and those that are calling for a wholesale reduction in our budget need to understand that. Regardless, you have my commitment that we are going to continue the good work that we've done and look for further savings and further efficiencies. We will also work with the newly formed Mayor's Commission to review our entire budget and operations. And we will continue to support the mayor's initiatives that reduce burdens and shift priorities away from the police and towards more community-centered solutions. All of these efforts should be done and will be done methodically and responsibly as we work together to build these alternatives. But we need these solutions in place first before any function is shifted. To quote Judge Berdar from his recent comments at the last quarterly public hearing, we must, quote, set up those systems and the city must prove that those systems work all prior to any budget-related cuts to the police force, not the other way around. It is, in his words, quote again, the lawful sequence. I say all of these things to give you the facts of the situation and to provide my professional assessment as a law enforcement executive of a major city under a consent decree. In closing, I've said before, change does not happen fast enough for anyone's liking, not for yours, not for the mayor's, not for any of your constituents, and not mine for that matter. But I believe that our department has made great progress. And I take issue with any narrative that says otherwise. Today, you have a department that is actively concerned about reining in costs and enhancing accountability. You have a department that supports our residents' First Amendment rights probably as well as anyone in this country, all the while protecting the public safety of the city. You have a department that places an emphasis on education, training, and professional development for its officers. You have a department that is approaching tense situations with de-escalation as a first resort and use of force as a last one. You have a department that is actively working towards initiating other alternatives to a police response. You have a department that is setting the example on a national stage and leading the efforts on policing reform. This was not the case just a few years ago. Reforming this department is a continuous, laborious effort that is happening every day. It is a long, hard process, and no one ever said that it wouldn't be. But progress is happening. Use of force incidents are down, while as of this day, we've taken more than 30% more guns off the streets of Baltimore than we did this time last year. Still, violence persists. Homicides and shootings remain exceedingly too high, but our detectives are making some very good cases with the help of the members of our community. The mayor's group violence reduction strategy is on the eve of being debuted, which will allow us to both address root causes of crime as well as disrupt the actions of repeat violent offenders, while for those who will accept our help, simultaneously providing a pathway away from a life of violent crime. All of this is important and would not be possible without the good, hard work of the men and women of this department. And we want them to keep up that good work, and we want them to make their careers here, and we want to encourage others to do the same. So I respectfully and humbly ask you to show your support for these efforts and for these reforms and for making the BPD the greatest comeback story in America. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you this evening, and thank you for taking my views into consideration. And for most of all, thank you for the relationship that we've developed with one another that has allowed us for this honest, open, direct dialogue. I'll now hand it off to Director Raymond to briefly outline the cost drivers in this year's budget. Then we'll continue with the presentation.
Good evening, Chair Costello, Vice Chair McCray, members of the committee, members of the council. I'm Henry Raymond, Director of Finance. I appear before you this evening to share more information regarding the fiscal 22 recommendation for the Baltimore Police Department. As Commissioner Harrison indicated, the year-over-year increase was 4%, representing $21.4 million. And those cost drivers for the general fund increase are due to three areas: pension contribution, workers' compensation, and healthcare benefits. And I'll explain in more detail each of those and the cost associated. As it relates to the pension contribution, the city makes an annual required contribution into the fire and police pension system based on an independent actuarial analysis. That analysis includes many factors such as investment returns, inflation assumptions, salary growth, and member longevity, in addition to other demographic factors. The growth in the fiscal 22 recommendation is largely due to lower than projected investment returns in fiscal 2020, which has had the impact on the city's fiscal 22 contribution. The police general fund costs grew 7.6 million in fiscal 22 versus fiscal 21 in this category. So for the pension contribution, it was an increase of 7.6 million, largely due to lower than projected investment earnings in fiscal 20, primarily as a result of COVID-19. Now, the second driver, workers' compensation cost. The city makes an annual contribution to the city's risk management fund on behalf of all employees, and this is also based on an independent actuarial analysis. This analysis looks at both historical workers' compensation claims and the current risk of exposure to city employees. The costs are projected to grow for fiscal 22 for the police department, as they are frontline workers and still having increased exposure to COVID-19. The police general fund costs grew 5.8 million for fiscal 22 versus fiscal 21 for this category. Finally, healthcare plan increase. As a cost-saving measure, the city moved its retirees in calendar 2021 to new Medicare Advantage plans. This change led to a net savings of $10 million citywide, but there were premium increases in the active employee benefit plans. These costs are allocated to city agencies in the budget on a per position basis. The police general fund costs grew 7.3 million for the fiscal 22 planning year versus fiscal 21 for this category. So in summary, while there was a $21.4 million general fund increase for the police department, nearly all of it was a direct result of the three cost drivers: pension contributions in the amount of 7.6 million, workers' compensation costs in the amount of 5.8 million, and healthcare plan costs in the amount of 7.3 million. Those three alone are nearly 21 million of the 21.4 million overall general fund increase. And I hope that this discussion helps clarify what the increase was due to and why those increases were required. Because again, for pension contribution and workers' compensation contribution, they are driven by independent actuarial study and analysis. And finally, healthcare plans, that's driven on a per employee basis for active employees based on the type of plan that the individual has. So I hope that with this overview, the council has a very good understanding of what the increase, the $21.4 million increase was due to. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Raymond. I'm now going to continue the presentation, and we'll start with our accomplishments for FY21. You've heard me in my opening remarks speak about our achievements in bringing down our overtime spending. We've also completed the relocation of the Central District and opened the 4th Baltimore Community Intelligence Center at the Central District. We've begun deploying the new digital records management system, which will replace the outdated and highly inefficient paper-driven process of the past. The new system will revolutionize the department and allow us to accurately provide data on crimes committed and enforcement actions taken in real time. This is critical to gaining compliance with our consent decree and operating a modern 21st century police department. We anticipate that the system will be fully implemented by the end of the year. In our continuing efforts to implement the consent decree, transformation of the department, and further strengthen our relationship with the residents we serve, we've completed consent decree approved training on the following topics: EPIC, or ethical policing is courageous; stops, searches, and arrests; sexual assault investigations; and public integrity or internal affairs investigations. To ensure that every situation receives the least intrusive response and the appropriate skill and experience level, we are working with the mayor and Muncie to develop the diversion pilot for behavioral health calls for service. Last month, BPD was the first city agency to publicly release its strategic framework for advancing equity. We believe this is vital to creating more equitable outcomes from BPD's interactions with the public. This effort will ensure that we have the tools and the structure to become the fairest, most transparent, diverse, and inclusive BPD possible. Now that we've trained the entire department in our new use of force policies, we're beginning to see dramatic reductions in the amount of use of force complaints filed against our officers by members of the public. While the statistics for homicides and non-fatal shootings are up over last year, we've also seen a significant overall reduction in Part 1 total crimes, nearly 20% decrease. Next slide for 2022 goals. Now, as we look forward to 22, we've developed a number of goals for the department. First and foremost, we are weeks away from the debut of the mayor's group violence reduction strategy. We have been working diligently with Muncie and the state's attorney's office and some of our federal and state partners on this program that will allow us to focus on repeat violent offenders. It will also allow us to utilize trained violence interrupters to prevent and deter retaliatory acts of violence while leaning on community-based organizations to provide access to services to those who want to break the cycle of violence. In order to make the best use of the sworn resources we have, We're working to ensure that officers are dispatched to only those calls that require a law enforcement response. To that end, we've been advocating for the adoption of legislation to reduce false burglar alarms. This is one of the many initiatives we can pursue to reduce or divert calls for service. As we've discussed before, police are called on to be all things to all people. We will be implementing additional initiatives in partnership with the mayor's office to reduce or divert more calls for service to free up officer availability for community engagement. BPD is currently in the process of gathering requirements for a new early intervention technology solution that will allow the department to more fully assess officers for risk and send them to counseling and/or retraining before negative outcomes manifest themselves. Finally, we will be working diligently to continue to address our sworn staffing shortages by hiring at least 240 police officer recruits in the next year. As you may recall, in 2020 calendar year, we hired more recruits than we have in a prior 10-year period. Next slide are the service areas. I'll now go through each of our services and provide you a brief description of each. Our first service area is the Administrative Bureau, which includes all agency-wide administrative support to the department, such as asset management, human resources, fiscal and grants, building security, central records, quartermaster, executive protection, public affairs, and legal affairs. Next is the Police Patrol Division, which includes all 9 neighborhood district commands that respond to daily 911 calls. It also includes the district action teams and district detective units, as well as neighborhood community officers. The Inner Harbor Unit, Casino Mini District, Downtown Foot Deployment, and the Chief of Patrol's Office are also in this service. Next is the Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, and it includes all centralized investigation functions, including those responsible for investigation of murders, commercial robberies, family crimes, and sex offenses. It now contains our group violence reduction strategy resources as well. The service also includes task force groups that work alongside federal law enforcement, and then other partner agencies on warrant apprehensions and auto thefts. The Data-Driven Strategies Division includes those responsible for collecting, analyzing, and disseminating intelligence and crime data throughout operations. This service also includes units such as the Watch Center, City Watch, and CompStat. Then there's the Public Integrity Bureau. Investigates all claims of police misconduct, including allegations of discourtesy, excessive force, and criminal activity. This service also investigates all serious use of force incidents, including police-involved shootings. Then there's the recruitment section, which includes those responsible for recruiting new sworn personnel for our academy. This service also contains several dozen vacant positions for new police trainees who are entering the department to start in one of our regular academy classes. Then the Crime Lab and Evidence Control Division, which includes the personnel responsible for recognizing, recovering, recording, analyzing, reporting, and storing evidence. This service is comprised of multiple forensic lab functions and storage vault facilities, and provides 24-hour evidence collection services at all of our crime scenes. And there's the Compliance Bureau, which encompasses all functions related to education and training, consent decree compliance, performance standards, audits, inspections, information technology, and advancing equity. The body-worn camera unit and consent decree implementation are also housed within this service. The Special Operations section, which includes all specialized tactical units such as SWAT, our bomb disposal unit, our aviation unit, the mobile metro unit, secondary employment, special events, and all traffic-related functions. The Patrol Support Services Division, which includes our community and youth section, dispatch and 911 communications, the telephone reporting unit, and central and juvenile booking sections. Overall, my team and I are now available to discuss these services in more detail. Thank you for your attention. That concludes the department's presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner. If you could take down the presentation. I want to now turn it over to Solicitor Shea for the remainder of the presentation before we get into council member questions. Solicitor Shea. I think you're on mute, sir.
Council President Mosby, Council Vice President Middleton, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chairman, members of the City Council, both the Ways and Means Committee and others. I'm Jim Shea, I'm City Solicitor, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to address all of you this evening on this important topic. I think there is general agreement that the consent decree and its aims are what we want here in Baltimore. Those aims include a change of culture within the police department, a growth of trust of this community in the police, a recognition of equity for the citizens of Baltimore, and a focus for the police department on constitutional policing. I believe very strongly that cutting the department's budget would undermine that effort and interfere with the attainment of those goals. Resources are needed in many areas, and particularly in order to pursue successfully the consent decree. Information technology is an important piece of that. That requires resources. Training of police officers and the development of a strong community policing effort require resources. And without proper staffing, and in view of our chronic understaffing of the police department, training and community policing become almost impossible to achieve. We have made so far, I believe, and I believe others agree, some tentative and frankly fragile progress in attaining these worthy goals. Those who believe that we have made progress currently include Chief Judge Bradar, who, as you all know, oversees the consent decree effort. It is clear, according to Judge Bradar, that cuts in the police department's budget would hurt that consent decree effort. The successful implementation of the consent decree will ultimately enable there to be a reduction in the police department's budget. As we focus the police on their core job and move other services in mental health, substance abuse, and others to more appropriate agencies, that will happen, and Judge Bradar said that at the last quarterly public hearing. But he emphasized with some vigor that the time is not now to cut the police department and its services because, quite bluntly, there is nothing in place to provide the services that are needed in these important areas of mental health, substance abuse, and others. The court made it very clear that the consent decree and his oversight of the consent decree required the resources needed to get there. We in Baltimore are under a court order. We agreed initially to the consent decree, but now that has been embodied in a court order. The court has wide-ranging power to enforce that order. Indeed, the sanction of contempt of court is not only readily available to this judge, it is quite broad and flexible. In short, the court will be able to do what it takes to make the city compliant with the details of the consent decree. Those sanctions include fines to incarceration to extremely draconian sanctions such as receivership. I'm not saying, and no one's saying, that incarceration or receivership is on the immediate horizon, but they are among the arsenal of sanctions available. What is clear that a cut of any substance to the police department will bring on immediate repercussions. At a minimum, such action would intensify the scrutiny applied to the police department in this effort and will prolong the process, neither of which will help the citizens of Baltimore. So with all respect, I urge the City Council to maintain the police budget as presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Solicitor. That concludes the department's presentation. We will now take questions. Before we begin, again, I ask that council members as well as department personnel, please keep your microphone on mute until you are recognized by the chair. Once you are completed speaking, please put your microphone back on mute. Please keep your cameras on for the duration of the hearing. We are going to strictly adhere to the 2-question limit. We will go in the following order. We will go the council president, we'll go the chair of the committee, we'll go the vice chairs of the committee that are present in chambers, other members of the committee, and then other members of the council. And we will cycle through until we're completed in tranches of 2 questions per piece. I ask that we limit our remarks and any type of speeches and try to focus on direct questions for the police department to answer. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Council President Mosby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Harrison, as well as the command staff for your presentation and come forth tonight. One thing that we've constantly talked about when people see the Baltimore Police Department's budget in comparison to other budgets, as well as in comparison to other budgets increase or decrease over the past 40 years related to inflation, the one thing that always jumps out is the size of the budget. And I know we talked tonight about the structural fixed hard cost that's wrapped into the budget, but some of the costs are also somewhat what people would see unnecessary. And that's when we talk about like the legal affairs as well as the litigation settlements of BPD. Just a couple line of questioning. How does the city recoup settlement payouts of officers who've been convicted of crimes while acting in their official capacity as officers?
Thank you, Mr. Council President. I think I'm going to ask my legal person if she's on the call, if she can answer some of that.
Yes, I'd be happy to, Commissioner, unless the solicitor would prefer to field the question.
Feel free, go ahead.
Sure. In answer to your question, Council President, the department indemnifies and defends officers who are alleged to have committed civil infractions pursuant to its obligations under the MOU with the FOP, as well as the Local Government Tort Claims Act. And there is no general ability to recover settlement payouts in connection with those civil defenses.
Understood. I think I've seen estimates out there that substantiate payouts of about $3 million per year. Is that on average? Is that like your understanding as well? Would someone from finance or someone from the law department know that the annual amount?
I can tell you, sir, that the amount varies pretty radically year to year, depending on the nature of the cases that have been brought, met, and resolved in that particular year. I couldn't speak to whether that $3 million figure is a annual average, but I'd be glad to get that information for you.
Mr. President,
Yeah.
Mr. President, I can say for a budgetary standpoint, we do allocate approximately $3 million a year in a line item in our budget for legal settlements that I believe is the topic that you're referring to. We can give you a specific number if you give us a few moments.
Understood. So yeah, so we estimate about $3 million a year. When we go over that $3 million, where does the money come from?
That is a general fund line item.
And does it come in a way of supplemental?
No, sir. It's typically part of our allocation in the annual process. It does not come in the form of a supplemental unless it is a major appropriation item, which is funded outside of our department. And I would speak to Bob, who's going to talk a little bit about that process.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So the BPD budget does include an estimate for the expected cost of legal settlements. And like Eric said, that number has been roughly $3 million on average. What we've seen over about the past decade. There are also the city does sometimes face liabilities that are larger for certain cases, some of them that go back many years. We do make a contribution to what we call our risk management fund. It is in the budget. It's in a program called self-insurance. So we do make a contribution to the self-insurance fund for larger liabilities that exceed, the normal, smaller dollar payouts, the 25,000s, the 50,000s, and occasionally we do have big judgments. If a case goes to federal court, that can be into the millions of dollars. But in the budget, we felt that it's fair to allocate those, smaller ones to the police department because they do have some influence on bringing those settlements down. But the larger ones, especially the historical ones, sometimes that go back decades, are really hard to pin in that way.
Bob, how much do you have a number, or could you estimate how much you think the liabilities associated with GTTF total?
So I probably would, I would just say that we did settle some of the GTTF related cases, over the course of the past year. It's unclear how much of a liability is remaining. The longer that we go, we think we get, it becomes better, that there's less of a liability because there is a time frame by which you need to submit a claim. But the police department legal affairs did settle a bunch of GTTF related cases. We're not sure how much is still outstanding, but we do think we've brought the liability down significantly. And perhaps Lisa or somebody from legal affairs might have more detailed numbers on that at their fingertips.
That's right. Bob is correct that we did settle a number of those GTTF matters last fall. We settled them for, I believe, just a little bit over $13 million. There remain a handful of cases that were filed even before that. And we also do remain susceptible to the possibility of certain types of additional suits being filed today.
Has there ever been a longitudinal study done on these types of liabilities and payouts?
These types meaning GTTF liabilities and payouts, or?
Or just litigation settlements associated with, inappropriate actions while serving.
I'm not aware that one has been done, though it's possible that my predecessors in the law department might be aware of things that I'm not.
If I could, Chief Walden, part of what we find with the adoption of our consent decree provisions, our training and use of force, our training and stop searches and arrests, is an eventual decline in those complaints, which drive a lot of what you're describing in terms of claims and settlements against the city for indemnified actions of officers. So we are seeing a decline overall, like historically, but we still are carrying some of those legacy issues, such as GTTF. And ordinarily you would see, and you see this in other consent decree cities, that with the adoption of those policies, you see a reduction in those costs over time with the change in behavior of officers. And I think the commissioner might be able to speak a little bit more to that in his experience as well.
And I would certainly agree with the chief of staff that the litigation liabilities are going to be a sort of trailing indicator of the improvement to the officer conduct that is the result of the policy changes and training changes and other reform efforts that are being implemented today. So we're not litigating cases about what happened last week. We're litigating cases about what happened years ago and in some cases decades ago.
Understood. Bob, the fund that you mentioned for the higher dollar settlements, currently, how much money sits in that fund?
Sorry, a little delay on the WebEx. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So we can pull that figure for you. It's in our year-end accounting statements. I don't have it at my fingertips, but we can pull that number for you. Just to give you some context, we, again, the base police budget includes money for the smaller settlements, and we did over the last couple of years realize that we might have larger liabilities for either some of these GTTF cases or some of the historical ones that were mentioned. Again, some of them that go back decades. So we had gotten in the habit of, if we had some surplus at the end of the year and we realized that there was a large liability that we were going to have to pay, we had put some of that money aside to handle those liabilities. And so we were able to pay the most recent claims out of our fund balance without having to dip into current year resources. So, we took the perspective of trying to plan ahead for that and make sure we didn't get caught with no funds available. I'll have to check though to see how much is currently available, because we had set some money aside for some of the claims that we had mentioned earlier that had been resolved. But we can get you a figure on that balance shortly.
Understood. Last question. My assumption is, but Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, from like a bonding rating perspective, that these settlements have limited impact on our ratings, or do they?
Well, I think, the rating, the bond rating agencies look to a whole host of things. They look to, but one of the things they do look to is that you have reserves available for unanticipated liabilities. And so in this case, because we knew, as early as 2 to 3 years ago that we might have some larger claims that were coming through, we took the proactive step of making sure that we had those funds, set aside and available. So it is one of the things the bond rating agency looks at. But again, for having participated in those discussions with the rating agencies over many years, they look a lot broader. They look at, are you managing your recurring costs from year to year appropriately? Do you have, conservative methodology for forecasting revenue so that you don't get caught with deficits? They look at your reserve funds overall. They look at your economic development package and revenue sources. They look at a whole host of things. I would say this is, in the grand scheme of what they're looking at, it's pretty small.
Mr. President, I think Director Raymond wanted to add something to that response, if that's okay.
Yes.
Director?
Yeah. Good evening, Mr. President. I would just echo what the budget director indicated. The settlements are not a significant or material set of items that the rating agencies look at. It's more regarding the strength of the financial management of the city. Do we have written policies in place that we follow? Do we have the appropriate reserves established? And has management been prudent in its efforts to look forward to try to minimize potential issues? So I just wanted to add that.
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time, Mr. Chair. Just a couple last quick questions. One, when we talk about these settlements, is this best practice? Is there other cities, great old American cities like size to Baltimore, that kind of handle these issues differently, or most cities just pay out from taxpayer dollars for the bad acts of these employees?
Without doing a legal survey of the legal environments in other jurisdictions,
It's hard to answer.
excuse me?
You're saying it's difficult for you to answer?
A lot of these requirements are driven by local law. So as is ours in large part, the local government requires the indemnification obligation. And I can't speak to whether or not other jurisdictions are subject to the same, more stringent, more expansive, narrower legal requirements on how they indemnify the employees of the jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's kind of the direction I was going down the path. Legislatively, is there anything that could be done? I know partially it has to do with negotiating with like the FOP in this particular instance that we're talking about. Some of it has a lot to do at the state level as relates to providing the ability of going after pensions. I fundamentally believe that folks who are called to protect and serve, but do criminal acts while doing that and hurt our citizens and really hurt our city as a whole, because they break down the distrust of the community with the law enforcement partners. I think that ultimately we shouldn't be paying for their pensions for the rest of their lives. You know, their boats, their vacations, their children's college funds, whatever it is. So that's where I was kind of going down the path. Is there something that we could do locally from legislative perspective, as well as on a statewide level, to help break down so we're not coming out of pocket of $3 million per year and then paying pensions? I mean, again, thank you for the deference, Mr. Chair. You know, we constantly talk about the inflation or the increase associated with the new police budget, and we know that there's fixed costs, but inside those fixed costs, we're paying pensions to officers that really hurt the distrust of our city and really make it life difficult for the hardworking men and women of the Baltimore Police Department. So I guess that's where I'm going at. We're not going to solve it tonight, but definitely interested in looking at a way of trying to do a longitudinal type of study, as well as developing a way of looking at if there's other best practices out there for us to get ahead of this and for us not to have a rainy day fund for officers to hurt our citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of recruitment and attrition. You have you or someone from your team give me an overview on that, please.
Absolutely. Our Deputy Commissioner, Jim Gillis, oversees that as part of his portfolio. He'll be happy to give you our hiring and attrition numbers and where we are.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good evening, Mr. Chairman and the rest of the committee and Mr. President. As the Commissioner stated in the beginning of his opening remarks, we ended 2020 with the most number of hires for the police department in 12 years. And that was a great testament to the hard work that has gone into the development of recruit stat, which is our form of performance management that we work closely with the mayor's office on, that Commissioner Harrison instituted when he came here from New Orleans. And the performance management of recruit stat has paid dividends in the sense of seeing that we are seeing a turnaround in the hiring numbers. Just to give you a snapshot, Mr. Chairman, to answer your question about where we are right now, through the end of May, so June 1st, we have hired 70 people, and we have, and you also asked about attrition, we have lost 108 people through the same date, so the June 1st, essentially. So there is a split there of just over 30, essentially. And that, even though there is a wide gap there that exists right now, the last 3 months, meaning what we're in right now, June, May, and April, all are going to exceed or meet, but most likely exceed where we were for each of those 3 months in 2020. And so we had a great year last year, and we are seeing a better hiring for this time from last year. The first 3 months of this year, not as good as the first 3 months last year, but the issues that we identified through RecruitStat, our performance management, we addressed those issues, and now we are seeing in the output, the hiring number, the turnaround, which is outpacing last year for these 3 months.
Mr. Chair, also, we started a class today. The mayor and I introduced ourselves and met 46 new recruits at the police academy who started their first day today, and there are more in the pipeline to be hired. But BPD has a large group, one of the largest classes we've had in my 2 years of 46 today. And I think there were more, but a couple of them got called to military duty. It could have been 50, but it was 46 that were in attendance this morning.
Thank you. My second question, from the moment that someone clicks on the online application to express interest in becoming a police officer with the Baltimore Police Department to the moment that they are sworn in and receive their badge, what is the biggest impediment to getting them on board as a recruit? Talk to me about what that is and what we're doing to address that challenge.
I'll answer generally, and I'll let Deputy Commissioner Gillis go back specifically. The biggest impediment is when we have applicants, is getting them to complete the full application. Many times they're not local, and we want applicants to complete the full application. Many of them are applying to multiple departments, sometimes upwards of 10. across the country, and they're doing it remotely. And so our biggest challenge is to make sure they get their documents into us, completing the application, and then the necessary documents that we need to fact check everything that they're putting in their application, getting them to proactively provide that to us. And so we have a number of systems of accountability to make sure we can keep communication ongoing and stay in contact with them. But I'll let Gillis get a little more granular.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner and Mr. Chairman. Just to piggyback off of the commissioner, exactly what he just said. We are in an extraordinarily competitive environment nationally. And so we are going after applicants across the country and competing with other people, but we also have a very strong focus locally here as well. That's very important to the agency. It's very important to what we believe is creating the right police department for the city that we serve. And so we have the biggest impediment, like in the weeds, to answer your question, is are people, applicants falling out who are making it through the process and who would otherwise be committed to the agency, falling out in the background stage of the process. And what I mean by that is when there is a robust background investigation that is done on potential hires, law enforcement generally has some of the most stringent background investigations and hiring standards of any occupation in the country, for good reason, obviously. And we see a drop off based on the data sometimes in those backgrounds. So based on that data, what are we doing? We are working with the chief equity officer of the city, Dana Moore, with our own equity officer, Bill Joyner, and with our folks in HR and partners across the city to address some of those things that might be causing people to fall out in the background process. We've also worked with folks in Annapolis, our state delegation, to address some of those same issues down there in terms of, for example, marijuana recency usage and people falling out for something like that. That would be something that would cause someone to fall out in the background process. So we would love to work with you guys as well, the council that is, in identifying these issues and obviously working to recruit and help people get through the process in an equitable manner, especially.
Thank you, Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner. We will now go to Councilwoman McCray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, there have been 143 murders this year. With a police budget of $555 million, there is accountability that comes along with that figure. So my first question is, with the level of violence that we've seen thus far this year, do we have a summer crime enforcement strategy to slow down the pace of violence we are experiencing?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember. Yes, we have summer crime plans. As a matter of fact, they're tailor-made to each of the 9 districts. They were put into place May 1st, and each district commander produced crime plans that deal with the highest priority issue, which is violence in each of the districts. Where that violence is occurring, who the impact players are and who the bad actors are, and how we deploy our resources, focusing on both the individuals and the places and the quality of life issues that kind of either pull people towards or push people toward those acts of violence. And so the answer is, yes, we have a comprehensive crime plan, but we have very tailor-made specific summer plans for each of the districts to, number one, have high levels of engagement, high levels of enforcement when we observe violations, and to make sure we're in the right places at the right times and engage with the right people who we know are driving violence in our district. Are we always able to prevent people from these crimes of premeditation and passion? And what we're seeing is many times these individuals are people who know one another that are getting into arguments, and their arguments are turning violent, then fatal, even in domestic situations where people are living with one another and are family members. And a number of them have been blunt force trauma, where they've been killed, not necessarily with a gun, but with some other instrument, like a stabbing or some other instrument. So while the numbers are high, we're seeing an increase in a number of other types of motives. But yes, we have summer crime plans to deal with all of these issues, making sure commanders are laser focused on when to be in a place, where to be, when to be, and with whom we should be engaged.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'd like to make a formal request that the city administrator and also yourself set up times over the next week to brief interested council members on these plans.
Nina, what number is that? 60. Okay, so council member request 66. So Michelle, if you could please send an email this evening to the president and the entire council. Please be sure to copy Lawrence Anderson, Matt Stegman, Nina Themlis, and Natasha Mihu, and offer briefing times for the commissioner. And I'm assuming, well, let the commissioner deem who's appropriate to be in that meeting, but offer up briefings to council members. Councilwoman McCray would by no later than Friday, would that be June 18th, next Friday, call of business June 18th. Would that be acceptable?
Mr. Chair, that would be acceptable. That's also going to complete my questions for the first round.
Thank you, Councilwoman. So those meetings will be offered anytime between now and call of business Friday, June 18th. I believe that's a Friday. Okay, thank you. Councilman Schleifer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two very specific questions about budget items. Before I do, I just want to thank you, Commissioner Harrison, for implementing a lot of the changes that you stood before us 2 years ago in this very room saying that you were going to implement. And so thank you for implementing those changes. Obviously, we're all outraged at the level of violence, but certainly we are seeing progress being made. I also want to thank the hardworking members of the department across the board, with a few exceptions, but I want to thank everybody for the work that they're doing across the city. The first question I have is on Service 623, which is on page 213 of our budget detail book. And every year I ask about the same two things, and I'm very supportive of the same two things, which both lead to clearing cases, and that is CID and the crime lab. And when looking through the budget book, first on page 213 on CID, we see that there's 40 positions that were transferred away from CID to other parts of the department. So I want to know what the reasoning is for that, and is there a reasonable amount of staffing at CID that we have to be able to shift to other items?
Absolutely. My chief of staff will be able to answer that for you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Councilman. So part of what we did in this budget is look through historical vacancies that were carried in our budget through the department. So as folks, when they leave the department, they leave from wherever they were. We saw a lot of vacancies in CID, and as part of our cleanup effort, and we'll probably catch this as another detail throughout the budget, is with the implementation of Workday, there have been issues of making sure folks are categorized in the right areas in the budget terms. And so we have them in the right cost centers. For us, we were trying to make certain that vacant positions, which is what you see moved here, were established in the patrol sector instead of in CID, because we don't want to be in a situation where we're essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul, pulling from patrol constantly without a plan in place for a deliberate repopulation of CID resources once they are hired into the department. This is, again, a result of us trying to maximize the folks in patrol, and that's what you see in this budget reflected.
So both in Service 623 and Service 642, they're not actually people being moved from those services to the other services listed, such as 19 to recruitment section, 11 to administrative, 5 to patrol,
right.
4 to PIB.
No, what you see is that's correct. Your assertion is correct. The vacancies are being reallocated to the right spots in our organizational structure. And again, we have a significant number of vacancies that we have to try to make sure that they're planned correctly in the organizational structure. And that's what's reflected with the Workday changes we've made in the FY22 budget.
Gotcha. So what I'll just ask is in future budget years, if when there's vacancies elsewhere, if they can same find their way to both Service 623 and Service 642.
Well, I appreciate that. The commissioner talks about this all the time. And without speaking for him, I'll say that, trying to understand how we grow the department, what priorities get funded first and second, that's a constant question that we're trying to answer.
I'm glad I can answer that one for you. So my second question is, there's been a lot of rumors out there regarding budget cuts at the district level. Can you talk to that? Is that actually reality? Or were district commanders asked to cut their budgets?
There were no conversations or directives given to any commanders about district level budget cuts. The only thing we have ever done was assigned and allocate an amount of overtime for commanders to use for specific goals, and only with permissions, people asking for permission and permission being granted, but we have not had any conversations about budget cuts at the district level.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Let's jump to Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, colleagues, Mr. Commissioner, good to see you this evening.
Good to see you, sir.
Good to be seen. So the first round of questioning I had, so as you know, as the co-chair of the Human Trafficking Collaborative and advocate for issues around sex crimes, that sort of ecosystem. At a previous hearing we had in the Public Safety Committee, it was noted that the closure rate for rape was at 0% at that time. Has this changed? And if not, or really at that point it was still a disappointing figure. What are we doing to address that, and why are we not sending more resources to sex crimes and child abuse?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And so I'm going to invite my new Deputy Commissioner of Operations to come in, who was the chief of CID at the last time we had that hearing, to talk about some of the improvements we've made, some of the protocols put in place to handle those sexual assault investigations.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Commissioner Harrison. Councilman Burnett, at our last hearing, you asked that question, and I wanted to just give you a more well-rounded understanding. When you saw the clearance rate related to sexual assault, one of the things that we noted, there is a national study going on in terms of how we're dealing with sexual assault cases with our victims. Bearing that in mind, we evaluated how we were dealing with case closures to include exceptional clearances. So it is our advocates shared some understanding and information, and it is not best practice that we exceptionally clear cases that could have an adverse effect on our victims. So with that, we put in some new protocols as to how we exceptionally clear cases and how we respond to those very sensitive cases. So with that, that has an effect on our clearance rate in where SIS is concerned, sexual assault specifically, rape. And Colonel Herzog, could you share what that number is?
Yes, ma'am, and good evening. So our current UCR clearance rate is 22% for rape. And the other thing, just to add a little bit more to DC Briscoe's response as well. So this year we did add an additional 6 detectives to our sex offense unit. And so we were sitting at 7, I believe, when we talked about this last time with you, and now we are up to 13 total detectives. So we have a young unit, but they're learning and they're coming along, coming along quickly. And that is going to hopefully, in the long term, add to that and that clearance rate and reduce that overall caseload.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chair. Can you give insight into, or anybody on the call, insight into, is there a backlog on evidence testing, particularly testing of rape kits, DNA rape kits?
Good evening, Councilman. This is Chief Yeager. The biology section is 100% right now, not running any backlog. but over the last, 2 or 3 decades, there have been rape kits in ECU, and those are now being processed. So we do have a backlog of about 400, but that's going back about 20 years, and they are being processed. There's a new initiative to get those done. Request to the lab.
Mr. Chair, you mind if I ask just like a quick addendum to that?
Quick addendum. Yes, sir.
So you said it's a 20, far back as 20 years. What is that as the full window that you're looking at?
I'll have to get back to you specifically with that, but I believe we're probably going back 40 years, back to about 1980.
Yeah, if you could just supply me the range. So if it's like from 5 years ago to 40 years ago, that's different than, total, historic backlog. That I would still consider that pretty recent for the victim.
Yeah, yes, sir. We have all that information. In fact, the state's attorney completed an audit in the middle of last year. I can get you all that data.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got more questions, but I'll wait for my turn again.
Thank you, Councilman. Council Vice President Middleton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just get right to my my two questions. The first one, I know you had mentioned foot patrol, and we bring this up every year. We know you do it downtown. We know the reasons why. But in the council districts that are not in the downtown area, go to community meetings and we hear it over and over again. When is the foot patrol going to start in their areas? We gave suggestions of maybe utilizing cadets, so on. Have not seen a plan for foot patrol. So before you respond, Mr. Chair, I'd like to add that request with Councilwoman McCrae's request, in that we'd like to see a plan where you are going to have a strategy that that community can see foot patrol. A lot of things are done behind the scenes and residents do not see things. And this is one thing that makes a presence, to show that you are working and participating. I know we're coming out of pandemic. This is the perfect time to get a plan together, a strategy together, and work with communities. We hear this over and over again when you have those district monthly meetings. We now want to see an added plan that you include the cadets. So my request is to have that part of your strategy when you meet with the council district representatives.
Madam VP, just so I understand and we capture this correctly, Councilwoman McCrae's request was for BPD to reach out and hold a briefing with each council member who wishes to have one prior to COB Friday, June 18th, to discuss the summer crime plan. As part of that briefing, you would like the police department to provide information on, and then I'm going to say blank and have you fill in the blank here.
Part of that discussion needs to be a plan of how you are going to deploy foot patrol in our neighborhoods throughout the entire Baltimore city.
Okay, so, and do we want to limit that to foot patrol, Madam VP, or do we want to just say patrol deployment?
I want foot patrol.
Okay, so, and I'm going to add to that. I'm going to say patrol deployment, including, as the VP pointed out, foot patrol. Michelle, does that work for? Okay, perfect. Madam VP, consider it done. Back to you, ma'am.
And so my second question, I don't know if the commissioner wants to comment on that before I move to the second question.
Yeah, please. First of all, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Now, I will say that we measure, that's one of the things we measure in our weekly ComStat every Thursday. And what I'd like to do is when we meet, we want to show you our ComStat model so you can see how we compel the commanders to demonstrate to us what percentage of the time officers are on foot patrol, on business checks, on directed enforcement, on traffic stops, on community engagement and crime walks, and all of those things. And we have that broken down by percentage, which districts are doing it, which districts do it better, how much of the time they're spending. And then secondly, we have now the first comprehensive community policing plan that's on our website that we are about to train formally for the first time, train all of our members on what community engagement and what real community policing really is. But built into that community policing plan, ma'am, is what we call neighborhood policing plans, which allow community members and the district commanders to co-create the kind of community policing model specific for your district, because what you need in your district may be different than what someone else wants in a different district. And that training is forthcoming. It's on the way this year, this fall, so this summer and this fall. And so your community members can participate in that training so that they can work and you can work with your commander to design exactly what you want. Now, we already have that in place and we monitor that, and it may not be where everybody's seeing it as often as you'd like to see it, but we promise you that we're doing it. We promise you that we'll improve on it.
Thank you.
And we'll demonstrate to you in the meeting that we are doing it and how we'll be able to improve on it going forward.
Thank you. And so my second question, kind of twofold. Another thing that we constantly bring up every budget session, and that, and you are working and succeeding on that, and that's promoting females in your workforce. And thank you again for that success. I guess this question is, are you helping, is there a strategy to help females in leadership roles to, they're in these new positions, you just did a big promotion. Do they have backup where they are getting that beginning help to be successful? And I guess attached to that, you have a high number of recruits that you say you're bringing in. Are you, I'm a believer, you're invested in your community if you live, if you live in Baltimore City. Are these employees being encouraged to live in the city as well?
Yes, they are encouraged to be living in the city. And once again, we started a class of 46 this morning. I went around and shook every single hand, asked every single person their name, and then I asked them where they were from. I would say out of 46, maybe a fourth or maybe a third of them said they were from Baltimore. And the mayor was with me. And so we did a higher number in 2020, and we had a good number this morning that I was fairly impressed with. And so, yeah, we're constantly working on that because that's one of our goals. To answer your first question, yes, we are working to cultivate and develop leaders in our department and female leaders. Number one, I am sending 8 of my members, I believe 3 or 4 of them are females, to a 3-week senior leadership in policing institute. It's going to be held in Orlando, Florida. And we've already selected members from our department. And in my first year, I sent 2 female members to the same school to produce leaders and cultivate them for senior and executive leadership positions. And with the promotion of our first female African-American deputy commissioner, certainly we want to cultivate and mentor others to help prepare them for leadership in command and at the executive level.
Thank you. Training is so important. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Councilman Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to ask you about 2 things that I began discussing and asking the department about maybe 8 or 9 months ago. And I let you and your staff know that I was going to ask about them tonight. The first thing is about domestic violence. Police officers have the highest rate of domestic violence of any profession in the country. So it's of the utmost importance that we have good policy around this. within the department. And in the past, BPD has allowed officers to continue their employment with the department even when and after a judge has ordered them to surrender their firearms as a condition of a peace or protective order brought against them by their spouse or partner. And it's worth noting that a necessary condition that needs to be met for a judge to even issue a peace or protective order is that the court has to believe that there is a likelihood that the actions reported by the appellant are likely to happen again. And I know of at least 2 officers who have been allowed to continue their employment as police officers after this has occurred. In fairly recent past, albeit before your time as commissioner, I would like to ask if it is the department's policy that officers in such circumstances would be dismissed were these things to arise today. Is the department's policy to allow them to continue or not?
Well, the department, okay, thank you for the question. The department's policy regarding officers who are accused of domestic violence, certainly if there's a protective order or any court order, the officer by our policy will surrender their service weapon. And if there's a court order and they are charged with a domestic violence incident, they are like any other citizen required to surrender any other firearms that they may have in their possession. However, I think the answer to your question, if an accusation is made against a member of our department and the officer is charged, I am not by law permitted to terminate a person at that point. There's still a criminal adjudication that has to happen and a conviction before I can actually terminate an officer.
I don't believe that to be the case, Commissioner. I believe that you can terminate an officer for being incapable of performing one of the basic necessities of the job of police officer. That is, being legally incapable of possessing a firearm. I believe that the judge's order to surrender all firearms is sufficient to be able to dismiss them.
I understand. I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I'm going to ask my legal person to come in and give an opinion on that.
Yeah.
Hang on one second. I want to on this one. I want to start off with City Solicitor Shea, and then let's go to legal person for BPD, please, and thank you.
The truth is, Mr. Chairman, I don't know the answer. I would have to take a look at it.
Then we're gonna do what we should have done from the beginning. But thank you, Solicitor Shea.
Sorry.
That's my fault. Miss Walden.
Yes, of course. It is the interpretation that we've taken to this point that certainly the type of order that you're speaking of, if it was permanently debilitating of an officer's ability to possess a firearm, that may be a different analysis. But when we are talking about pending a criminal investigation, potentially charges and trial, that is not sufficient to override the requirements of LEOBR with respect to the process to which these officers are entitled before disciplinary action, including termination, would be taken against them.
I've sought multiple legal opinions on this and believe that it is sufficient to dismiss the officer, that LEOBR is not a deterrent or a hindrance under such circumstances. And to be clear, I am absolutely not talking about any case where there might potentially be pending charges, and specifically with respect to domestic violence, because of the frequency of cases in which survivors never press charges because to simply escape the domestically violent circumstance is often enough for them to just get away and want to move on with their life and not press charges and continue to litigate and relive such abusive circumstances.
Councilman Dorsey, what I'd like to do here is this is a very important line of questioning. I'm grateful that you brought this up. I do want to put a pin in it because I don't want to debate legal opinions. What I would ask you to do, if you would like to pursue this, is request an opinion of our law department, who represents the mayor and the city council, and also suggest that you may consider seeking a legal opinion from the city council's counsel, those two words being spelled differently, but Mr. DeGraffenreich, who's formerly of the law department. So I'm going to leave it to you if you'd like to pursue that. If you would like the request of the law department as counsel to the mayor and city council to provide an opinion, we can make that an official request now. That would still require you to send something to Solicitor Shea and his team with the specifics of your
Understood.
request.
Got it.
Would you like that added as a request?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, and as part of that request, there is an expectation that you will follow up directly with
Yes,
the
sir.
law department, and I ask that you copy myself, Natasha, Nina, and Lawrence and Matt on that, please, and thank you, Councilman.
And Aaron DeGraffenreich.
And Aaron DeGraffenreich, yep. And if, thank you, Mr. President, and if you want to seek a separate opinion from Aaron, because he's, in-house with us on the council, you can pursue that. You're free to pursue that separately. That will not be added as an official request because the official requests are merely for the administration.
Got it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Back to you, Councilman Dorsey.
Thank you. My second question is regarding the fee for report policy of the department. I would say to many, would seem to add insult to injury to require a victim of a crime to pay money in order to get a copy of the police report of the crime against them. I understand that as a result of the conversation that we had last year, that an interim policy has been put in place, and that a permanent policy is being put in place as part of the new RMS system. Can you speak about the interim and plan for permanent policy change in order to no longer have to charge victims of crimes for a copy of a police report?
Yeah, I'll take that question. For the record, Michelle Wurzberger, Director of Government Affairs for the department. Thank you for the question, Councilman. We have a team of folks who are working internally on this issue because we agree with you that we don't want to doubly victimize our residents. And so we have figured out or developed a short-term solution that will be a manual solution, essentially, for those types of requests that are coming in. We are going to put a notice on our website so that folks are clear about how to go about engaging in that process and getting that report for free. But more importantly, we are working on a technological solution that will be built into the RMS system. And there's a variety of different ways that we're considering going about that. And so Woody, Chief Davis, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there, but before I hand it over to you, Councilman, I did want to let you know I did follow up in an email with you and did ask for you sometimes to provide you with a more in-depth briefing on both the short-term solution and the long-term.
Yep, I want everybody else to hear about it too.
Chief Davis, did you have anything else to add?
No, Michelle, I think you covered it very well. Thank you. Short term, for those who are victims, we're going to make it clear that they will not be charged. And we're going to look for ways to electronically build a system so that it doesn't have a heavy reliance upon human intervention, which is the current process that we have today.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. You go to Councilman Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good to see you, Commissioner Harrison.
Good to see you, sir.
Team. My first question is with regards to recruitment. It's, of course, we struggled with recruitment for years. I think in looking through the data, I noticed that despite having one of our best years in recruiting, we still saw a decrease in officers by 53. We still lost a net total of 53 officers. And it got my mind jogging. Who's responsible for retention? What actions are we taking to keep officers here? Who's responsible for those measures and metrics? And of course, you're responsible as commissioner, but what service is really tasked with seeing us through on retention and is responsible for that metric?
Well, thank you for that. That is as important as recruitment. It's something we talk about every month with the judge when we are having our status conferences, and it's all about fixing the issues that cause people to drive. And we've done the research. We found that most of the people who separate from the department have been at the retirement eligible period of 25 years. We do have a large number of individuals who voluntarily separate, but they are between the 1 and 5 years. So it becomes important to us to understand why we're having voluntary separations. Certainly we understand the involuntary separations and terminations, but that's very important to us. Working conditions are the #1 reasons people cite. Sometimes in our exit interviews, we learn that they're most often just say personal reasons. Some will leave for other law enforcement agencies, but that number is very, very small. And it is not what we think it is. Most people leave the profession altogether. But the range is usually individuals between 1 and 5 years for involuntary separations. It's about working conditions improvement. It's about improving the fairness and equity of the promotional and the selection system, and then people having upward mobility and transparency into that process. That's usually #2 and #3 before we get to pay. And we're working, of course, we can't talk about what's happening in our FOP negotiations to fix a number of the issues, but we're certainly working to improve the working conditions, the upward mobility, the fairness and equity in the selection process, and the transparency in the selection process, so people feel like they can compete and have upward mobility and fairness in that process. Those are all the things we've been doing by putting officers in a new police station in the Central District. We have 80 new cars that we've ordered that are on the way, by bringing in this new technology and by making sure officers know that we are building as well, if not a better police department than most of our surrounding agencies, which are the reasons people will say they leave when they're honest about that. But I'll let one of our deputy commissioners jump in just for a moment to be a little bit more granular.
Mr. Commissioner, Jim Gillis here. Councilman, thank you for that question. And just piggybacking off the commissioner, and just to clarify, we did have a very modest net gain last year between hiring and attrition, which was +1. And that was the first time that has happened, I think, in 3 or 4 years. And so that was a great story, a great positive for that. But what we are doing overall, to answer your question, it's the entire agency, starting with the commissioners. He just said, it's everything you can think about factors into retention. And just like we set up recruit stat performance management to analyze and use data to guide decisions, we are doing the same thing with retention stat. That is being born out of the Compliance Bureau right now. And some of the things the commissioner just described, like the career ladders, equity in hiring and promotions, other types of ways that HR can factor in to try to retain people. We are trying to build the structure, and we're almost finished, frankly, and are utilizing it to actually have a robust retention stat to go together with recruit stat. We also partner with Johns Hopkins University to do exit interviews, which is where we get a lot of the data from. And what we have just come online with, and we would love to give a presentation for anyone who would want to see it, is a new technology called Pecan. Pecan essentially gives us the same exit interview type data, but real time. It is a ability for us as managers all the way down the chain to get instant feedback on what we are doing. And based on that feedback, we can be very nimble in addressing agency-wide, whether it is facilities issues, whether it is salary compression, whether it is inequity in facilities, or whatever it might be. We are able to use the actual employees' voices to guide our decision-making, and it's empirical data, and that is what we are doing. And so we are putting together the other half of basically the hiring end and then the leaving end, bringing them together.
And lastly, council member, while there have been fluctuations and improvements in the hiring, it has been pretty steady with attrition. The average number of departures per month has remained steady for about 10 years. And so while hiring goes up and down per month, the number of departures is about the same.
It's great to know. I would love to see the data that you guys have on exit interviews. So if I can make that a formal request, that for the last 5 years by year, getting a breakdown of those that have left and reasons why they left. I think that'd be really helpful to understand.
Councilman, let's just make sure we clarify that request. Just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So exit interview data for what length of period?
Last 5 years.
Last 5 years. Obviously, personally identifiable information not included. And what else specifically on that?
If you could break down the reasons why folks decided to leave by year. And so are we seeing that change over time? It would give you an idea of trends.
Okay. Michelle, Nina, everyone's good. What number, Nina? 70, request number 70. Thank you, Councilman.
Great. Thank you. And then I have my second question is around the Public Integrity Bureau. I was looking through your measures, and you guys measure complaints. You measure the investigation of those complaints, but do we measure or do we have a sense of corrective measures and their impact? Namely, do we know how often we see repeat offenders for the same type of issue, which would suggest that the corrective measures that we implemented did not work?
Great question, and the answer is yes, we do. I'm going to ask Deputy Commissioner Nato to join us in answering that.
Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Conway. So we do track that. We're actually building a dashboard now to do tracking analysis so we can see where those repeat offenders are. If we see repeat offenders, we take a second look at them, determine whether or not they should go to a separate unit to investigate. But the dashboard that we're building now, along with our strategy folks, will give us a much better insight into that so that we can keep track of that and take appropriate action.
Do we have a sense of at what rate folks tend to offend, or?
So we don't have an exact rate right now because we're building that. I will say from a observation standpoint from our people that go through the complaints, we don't have a large recidivism rate, but this dashboard will give us exact numbers. We'll be able to track that.
Good. That's good to hear. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Stokes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there any thought given to require employees to repay the cost or percentage of the cost associated with brutality liabilities? And I'm only using that because when you buy a car, you buy a TV, you get that extended warranty. So I'm looking at in terms of, have you looked at another insurance company not forcing the officers, but have that separate insurance? So the cost of the $3 million that we got to keep setting aside for lawsuits will reduce its cost. And did you ever look at that process? I don't know who can answer that, Commissioner, whoever from your staff.
Either I think someone from the law department or from perhaps city finance who might pay for that might have to help answer that.
Can I repeat the question again? Is there any thought given to require employees to repay the cost or percentage of the costs associated with brutality liabilities?
Let's hang on, Commissioner. Let's start off with the legal folks on that one, and I'll defer to Ms. Walden or Jim as a team, or Ms. Solicitor Shea, and then we'll go over to the finance folks because they deal with some of the contractual obligations, and then we'll go to the police department. Councilman Stokes, does that sound good?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's start off with the legal folks.
So if I follow the question, it's whether we've looked into the possibility of requiring police officers on whose behalf we either pay judgments or settle litigation for civil claims to help contribute to those payments. Is that the question?
To the cost, a percentage of the cost.
Yeah, right. So there really does not exist today a vehicle by which to accomplish that. There's arguably a provision, it's a fairly narrow and difficult to deploy provision in state law. Even then, though, we remain bound by the contractual obligations that we have to our police officers through the MOU, which require the city to indemnify litigation losses and don't provide a vehicle by which we would seek compensation back from the police officer in such a case.
So my question, my follow-up, have we ever looked at that to see if that can legally be done?
Certainly, there's been a fair amount of attention to that problem that has been focused on it since at least the beginning of the year. I know that it's something that, we've looked at sort of what the legal bases are for these obligations. So yes, it has been considered, certainly.
Okay, my second question is about illegal guns. And Commissioner, I know when you came to Baltimore, that was an issue I was pushing on the council. And I know the police department have a process how they identify guns and how they melt them down or destroy them. Can somebody explain how that process works and how being transparent that some of the residents, and there's some requirements, can go and see how those guns are melted down or destroyed?
Yeah, thank you for that. I remember you and I having that conversation on more than one occasion. We committed to you that, number one, we were melting the guns down, and we were committed to you that we would prove to you and demonstrate to you that that actually happens. We had that conversation recently with members of my staff, and I'll ask my chief over my evidence to be able to talk about that right now.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. Good evening. Yes, Councilman, thank you for the question. And we stand ready to do that for either you or your staff or members of the community. What we had discussed before was ensuring that we vet persons before they go and view our process. And it's actually quite a lengthy process from identification of which ones are going to be destroyed to the inspection that's conducted both by my staff and in conjunction with the inspection team. And then, of course, another day is the transport to the destruction, where it's the weapons are viewed until they are destroyed in the at the facility. So we're happy to work with that, and I can get with you offline, you or your assistant, and start coordinating that.
And just one follow-up, so I know it's been a while, but those persons, how many of the community persons can be selected? And there will be a background check from those community persons first before they are selected to be part of that process. Am I correct?
That's correct. What we planned on doing was the same type of background check that we would do for anybody that we would be returning a firearm to. So just a basic background check. With COVID and close quarters, we'd like to keep the numbers small, but we can certainly do more than one occasion. So if you wanted to give us names of 2 or 3 people, we might not get them all at once, but we might be able to get them on separate trips.
And I think they should go to the committee and the whole council. I'm sure they would want that information also. So thank
Yes,
you, I
sir.
appreciate it. And also, can you?
Councilman Stokes, before you finish that out, let's just go back to the piece that you said should be provided to the whole council. Can you repeat that again, please, Councilman?
The process when guns are selected to be destroyed. Am I saying that correctly? There's a 5-step process before they get to that point when wherever they take them to destroy them. The transparency part of selecting some community people to understand what the process is, and once they're selected, they do the background check. Then they'll be able to, I guess, go where you destroy or melt the guns down. Am I correct on that? So knowing what the process is, how the guns are selected, it's a 5-step process. And then those community persons that are selected being a background check will have an opportunity to go wherever the guns are destroyed or melted down. Is that sound?
So that sounds to me, Councilman, consistent with what you've historically been leading on in the council the past couple of years. Let me ask Michelle and Eric and Commissioner Harrison, is that as you understand? Are we clear on what the councilman is asking for?
I think we're clear on what the councilman's asking for, and I think he's asking not just for the process, but for community members to be able to witness the destruction of guns. As I understand it, and my chief of evidence will be able to elaborate on this, there is some level of secrecy of where that's happening to prevent people from going there to take the guns and steal the guns back. So it's not a place within the city limits.
So let's bifurcate that. Let's start with the first half of it, the process. Can the council get something in writing that outlines the process from start to finish with those 5 steps that Councilman Stokes referenced?
Yes.
Okay. Nino, 71. And Michelle, you're good on your end? Okay, excellent. Now, to the piece about community witnessing or community observation to provide accountability. Councilman, I'm going to ask you to step in here and interrupt me if I get this wrong or I speak out of pocket. Again, I want to recognize that you've really been leading on this issue the last 4 years or so. I'm not terribly confident we're going to get that issue resolved tonight. That being said, this transcends this goes back multiple administrations in the police department. And this is something that Councilman Stokes, again, has been leading on and working on with folks. Can we get a commitment from the police department that you all are going to work in good faith with Councilman Stokes and have the council president's office at the table to get this to a more transparent place?
Yes, we absolutely believe this is doable. My team and I are familiar with the councilman's request, and we understand what the ask is. We're working to figure out how, but we do believe it's doable, and you have my commitment to working with the council member to facilitate that.
And if I could just add one final point there, when the councilman and I spoke the other day, we did talk about this, and we promised that we would schedule a briefing on this matter and another matter. We did send an email today soliciting some dates and times. We will, in fact, loop in the council president's office, and Mr. Chairman, if you'd like, we can loop you in as well.
Excellent. Councilman Stokes, does that adequately satisfy that first piece of it?
Sure, and just want to add one piece. There are scheduled times when that process happens. Can you make sure that's included also? And I think we should include Councilman Conway, who chairs safety, part of that meeting also. Thank you.
Okay. So Michelle, yeah, if you could keep Councilman Conway, myself, and then make sure you keep Lawrence and Stegman from CP Mosby's office linked in that. I don't need to be in that briefing, but just please keep me copied so I can make sure that Councilman Stokes was taken care of. Okay. Councilman Stokes, are you good, sir?
I'm good. Thank you.
Outstanding. Let's jump over to Councilman Torrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. Well, good evening now, Mr. Commissioner and leadership team. My question is preparation for redistricting and redrawing our district lines related to the census. This is extremely, I'm sorry to be district specific, very concerning to me because I have 5 of the 9 districts in my district. So I want to know what those lines are going to look like moving forward, or how we're preparing for that first.
Very good question. My team and I are always talking about that, and certainly pulling in census data will help us understand that. But along with census data, it really comes down to that plus workload analysis and making sure that the workload analysis equalizes work and volume of work across all the districts, so that wherever an officer works, the workload should be about the same. And so we look at population, but we look at distance travel, and we look at number of calls for service for part 1 crimes, part 2 crimes, and investigations. And all of those things factor in, number 1, how many officers should be assigned, something mathematically and scientifically, how many officers should be assigned to a district, how many detectives should be assigned to a district, how many officers should have uncommitted time for proactive work and community engagement, and all the things like that that get factored into that. But certainly our team is working on that. Once we get full census data, we'll begin to look at workload analysis to figure out what redistricting looks like, whether boundary lines move, or is there a recommendation for other recommendations that could come forward about district stations themselves. But certainly that's a high priority for us.
Thank you, Commissioner. That was definitely concerning because I think about the fact that most of my districts, but not all, have shortages in shifts. And think about the workload of those officers, but also being mindful of the fact that, do we really need 9 districts, to be transparent?
Well, that's hard for me to, almost impossible to answer.
That was just
now.
That wasn't a real question.
Yeah,
that was more so
in a redistricting exercise. That's exactly what the data will either be in support of or not, but it will be based on workload analysis to make sure work is equitably distributed across all the 9 districts, or could there be a recommendation for something different based on the number of people, the number of crimes, the number of calls that are not crimes, investigations, and uncommitted time like community engagement that this new community policing plan will produce. All of that taken into account with populations and distance travel with the workload analysis will produce the answers to that.
Thank you. And then in lieu of my second question, I wanted to add to the previous request by Councilwoman McCray, as well as the chair and Councilwoman, Council Vice President. My relation, I know we have bike patrols that are happening in the Central District, but I also want to know the deployment of our cadets as well, because one of the things I've learned from looking at New Orleans police model, you use cadets on the front lines in a way where they were interacting with the public in a way to create policing. So I want to know how we're going to use our cadets in terms of community policing.
Absolutely, and that's also part of our our broader community policing plan. Over COVID, we've had not so much of a robust application and hiring of cadets, but we have started back hiring more cadets, and we certainly want them to be not just a part of the crime fighting, but the community engagement, because they're part of the police department, and it is a pipeline for employment to recruits. Many of them will inevitably become recruits and join the department and become police officers.
I appreciate it. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. We're going to jump over to Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. It is good as always to see you. Thank you for the work that you're doing for us, for our city. Thank you. 8 days ago, was on a walk in my district and saw 13 officers in sort of a phalanx, one with a police shield, 6 cars. Was obviously concerned that something major was happening. Asked one of the officers what was going on and found out that it was a single person with some mental health challenges that was having potentially suicidal ideations, may very well have had a weapon, a knife, but seeing 13 officers was concerning for one individual with mental health crises. As we are moving toward a trauma-informed approach where Mayor Scott is reimagining and rebuilding systems geared toward having mental health professionals support folks who are having mental health crises, perhaps along with officers. I was concerned to see that many police, also knowing that having a shield, while defense against a knife, I presume, for someone who is experiencing suicidal ideations can be incredibly traumatizing. So I'm wondering how we are currently handling mental health calls within the department, because that seemed extremely excessive.
Well, thank you for bringing it to me. I can't answer why there would have been 13 there or why one person would have had a shield without knowing some of the context of what the call really was or what was happening or what information they were provided or what was actually happening then. What I'd like to do is either get Colonel Jones or Deputy Briscoe to kind of talk about how those calls get dispatched and what would be the requirements based on the threat assessment once we learn what's happening, either through communications or upon the first officer arriving. What would be the protocols for more than one or more than two or for multiple officers and supervisors being on the scene?
Thank you, Commissioner Harrison. Thank you so much for that question, Councilman Cohen. And to the Commissioner's point, it just depends on the variables of the call itself. So if we get a call for service, and I know you're saying that, you know, the person may have had a knife, but what we do not know, and I don't know the text of the call, we don't know whether or not there were other individuals that may have been inside of the home. So as a matter of protocol, it just depends on the variables when the call is dispatched. And then at that point, it depends on the layer of response that we have. That also dictates whether or not that call is going in, if it's isolated inside of the residence or if it's coming out to the community. So we have to have safety protocols in place to be able to support both actions. I can tell you that we do have a mobile, though a small force, we do have trained counselors that get in the vehicles with our officers. We of course look to increase that number, but when they're working and available, they respond to those calls to help to de-escalate. We have a basic 40-hour course that our officers go through to be able to respond to those types of calls for service. But again, we look to grow that force and that number. Our goal is to be able to resolve the situation with as less lethal force as humanly possible and to get the help and support services that are needed for the individuals calling and to keep the community safe at the same time. So without knowing fully the context of the call, all of those variables are taken into account when the call is dispatched in and of itself. I hope that answers your call. And if you have something more specific, we can perhaps dig into what that call type was and have a larger conversation.
And so to Colonel Briscoe's point, she's exactly right. So officers that are responding, they respond basically in a 4-tier kind of response. So what we want them to do first is secure the scene. Secondly, we want them to request our crisis intervention team to respond, who are the experts in that field, gather as much information about the individuals as involved as possible, and as best and as humanly possible, utilize de-escalation tactics to resolve this with less police interaction as possible. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Colonel, and thank you, Colonel. You know, and I would just second your point, Colonel Briscoe, about de-escalation. And to my mind, again, seeing 13 officers when we're constantly told that we have a shortage, dealing with one individual who, again, was reported to have a knife and reported to potentially be threatening to harm himself. To me, one, doesn't de-escalate. Two, you know, I want to juxtapose that, and this is my second question. I want to juxtapose that to Saturday night this last week, where in Fells Point around 12:31, there were 3 shootings. At the time, there were 8 officers in the entire vicinity. Approximately a little over 1,000 people there. At that point, there had been at least 3 pretty significant fights that had broken out. There were 2 major assaults that had taken place. And again, there were 8 officers. Given the serious issues we have around violence, I'm just trying to understand in my own mind why there would be 13 officers assigned to attempt to de-escalate one individual suffering from mental illness with a knife versus a scene where there had already been multiple assaults and fights this last Saturday.
Thank you for that. That's a.
I'm sorry, sir.
Let me take that, Colonel. That's a very good point. But once again, I would like to have known, number one, how the call came out and why all those officers were there. I would think that at that point, I began to question the supervisory decision to allow them to stay on the scene, because once the scene is rendered safe, I would then start making sure my officers got back to handling other calls. But I'd want to know what kind of call it was and why the decision was made to allow all of them to respond and not to clear them as soon as feasibly possible. But with regard to the 8 that were deployed to the area that night, you know, that was us, and we talk about this all the time. That was us balancing the number of officers working that night from the Southeastern District to be assigned permanently there throughout the evening versus the number of officers handling the rest of the district and making sure the other neighborhoods weren't stripped of all of their protection, thus being vulnerable. And going forward, it's always about assessing, and this is what we will do, making sure we assess to make sure we have the appropriate staffing so that the staffing can handle the crowd size, number one, to try to prevent as much as we can people from committing bad acts, and then to apprehend them when we do. But the goal is to be there visible to discourage and to deter that as much as possible. So your point is well taken. But with regard to the 13 people there, there's no way to know until we go dig and find the answer why they would have been there and what they were dealing with, and why the decision was made to allow them to stay there once the scene was rendered safe. I will look into that and get that answer back to you.
Thank you. I do appreciate that, Commissioner. Again, to me, the focus needs to be on violence. And, you know, we know that having 13 officers attempting to de-escalate what appears to be a mental health issue, you know, could actually exacerbate it. So again, appreciate it, and not to in any way throw the commander under the bus, because he's doing a phenomenal job with limited resources. But thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilman, hang tight for 1 second. Commissioner, can you just summarize for me in 1 sentence what the request was for Councilman Cohen, just to make sure we're all on the same page?
As I understand it, what I heard is the councilman needs an answer to perhaps why 13 people would have either been dispatched to a call of a person with a mental crisis, or why, if they weren't dispatched to that call, why they were there with a person with a mental issue, perhaps armed with a knife, or maybe not armed with a knife, but why they would have been on that call. And for my own edification, why for so long? Those are the things I would ask and try to find the answer and report back to the councilman.
Councilman Cohen, is that how you understand it?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't know how long they were there. I didn't stay for a particularly long time. So I don't want to speculate that, you know, I just don't know how long they've been there, but there were 13 officers. So I think yes, and I would like a little more detail, maybe in a separate briefing, about how we are currently responding to mental health crises.
Yes, sir.
Councilman, is that something you want followed up in writing, or is that something that can be handled with a phone call directly with Commissioner Harrison?
The phone call would be just fine. Yeah, just briefing on, take me through point by point. I don't want to do it in front of the committee on how we respond to those types of calls.
That's easily accomplished. We'll take care of that.
Thank you, sir.
Nina, what is that, 72? Councilman, you're number 74 in the raffle here. Commissioner, are you able to follow up with the councilman by, let's say by Tuesday, what is that, June 15th?
Yes, sir.
Councilman, is that a reasonable time frame for you?
That would be fine.
Outstanding. Thank you. All right.
Thanks, sir.
We are going to jump to.
We'll set that on.
Councilwoman Porter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Harrison, and your team for joining tonight. I wanted to follow up on a sustainability question that I had asked a few months ago at a particular briefing. You mentioned the diversion pilot program for behavioral health calls for service. I specifically asked for interagency implementation guides as it relates to process. So how you would handle it from your office, BPD, how the state's attorney's office would handle it, and also how like city agencies would handle it. I just wanted to get an update on those implementation and execution guides.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to, first of all, you bring up a good point. I remember talking about that. Our deputy mayor is here is going to be able to help answer that for us.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Hi, Councilwoman Porter. Thank you for that question. We will absolutely follow up. We can have Alexandra Smith from the mayor's office can send you the guides for that and kind of the interoperability, the safeguards we have in place, and all of the different policies and procedures associated with the pilot. She can get that to you this week.
Thank you so much. And just to follow up on Councilwoman Danny McCrae's question, I think that we should be implementing those types of implementation guides along with our summer procedures as well that she requested.
Councilwoman, just to confirm, there was a suggestion there, but not to be flippant, but there was not a specific request for follow-up with BPD. Is that correct?
Oh, I'm so sorry. There was a specific request for BPD, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
I wanted the implementation guides that Alexandra Smith from the mayor's office is going to send me to complement the plans and procedures that Councilwoman McCrae just talked about earlier in the hearing related to summer deployment of Baltimore City Police Department resources.
Okay, just to clarify, Councilwoman, you would like that documentation provided to you electronically, or is that something that you would like to digest and then discuss with the police commissioner, or both?
No, it would actually be both. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry if I'm not explaining this correctly.
No. It's not you. And honestly, I ask about 9 questions before I get this nailed down. So you're doing well here.
No worries, sir. So earlier in the hearing, Councilwoman McCrae had requested for Baltimore City Police Department to have follow-up briefings with interested council members related to how the department was going to reduce violence during the summer months. What I am saying is that those implementation guides that Alexandra Smith will be sending me should complement those plans and procedures that will be discussed with each of the interested council members. So does that make sense?
I think so. So you want to see the guides, the documentation, and then when you have a conversation with the commissioner about the department's summer crime plan, you want to also discuss with the commissioner how that's connected to the guides, right?
Exactly. They should all be interconnected. That's the gist that I'm getting.
Okay, Michelle and Nina, can you please pin that for Councilwoman Porter's conversation with the PC specifically? So, and Councilwoman Porter, for your conversation with the PC, can we give the department an extra week and also give you some extra time to kind of digest those guides so that you and the commissioner have a more productive and meaningful conversation?
Sure, that's perfect. Yep.
Okay, so Councilwoman Porter's meeting will be by no later than call of business Friday, June 25th. And we'll also include a discussion of the guides in addition to Councilwoman McCrae's request. And Nina, can we ensure that those guides are sent from the mayor's office by no later than this Friday, which would be, what is that, June 11th? Call of business Friday, June 11th. That's doable on the mayor's office end? And that's doable on BPD's end? see head shaking up and down, so I'm confident we'll get that done. Okay, Councilwoman Porter, we're good to go.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I have one more question.
Please.
This is, this is for the commissioner. I, excuse me. I was reading the strategic plan, and you know the overall execute, and correct me if I'm wrong. The overall execution of the consent decree is about 8 to 10 years. I did have a follow-up question related to that timetable. How long do you think it would take, considering the current defunding or reallocation of resources toward public safety strategies for this current budget to truly reflect those changes into more of a community policing model that you discussed throughout the night and throughout the strategic plan?
Oh, I so appreciate that question. I don't think that this consent decree is an 8 to 10 year consent decree. I will say that I was hired and got started in the second year, and a lot was done, but we began to move really fast in the policy creation and in the training in years 2 and 3 and 4, which we're still doing training, and now we're into implementation. I do believe that this department is making great progress, but the lack of technology has not allowed us to move as fast as we can, because we can't do the outcome assessments and audits without the appropriate technology, because we're still in a paper-based environment. However, this new RMS will probably expedite the pace in which we're moving, where the monitoring team in DOJ can do its audits and compliance inspections and outcome assessments digitally, instead of having to go through millions of paper documents just to do an audit to see if we're in compliance with any one component or the other. I do believe that and this is a conversation we have internally and with the monitoring team all the time, as we move through this year and next year and future years, as we come into compliance, what the monitoring team will be focused on should diminish over time. Now, I can't speak for them, but as we come into compliance, those things require less and less monitoring, and so there could be cost savings. I can't say how that measures up against where the budget is, but my experience has been, as you move through toward compliance, full compliance, there's less work to be done by the DOJ and by the monitoring team. How that translates to cost, I don't know how to produce that answer tonight.
No, I thank you for that. And I believe that the pilot is actually starting in the Southern District under Major Conaway, who's done exceptional work down in the Southern District. And so once you get, if possible, Mr. Chairman, if we can get some preliminary data related to that pilot program from the RMS pilot that the commissioner is talking about, then we can begin to kind of see some of the fruits of that technology justification that you're talking about in relation to the overall execution and success of the consent decree.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Let's go to Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues. Thank you, Commissioner Harrison and team. I have a few questions, but I'll start with my my budget-related questions. Is it possible to outline what is consent decree expenses and what is regular operating expenses? We don't have that in the budget.
I think the answer to that is yes, and we can figure out how to do that and get that to you.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I think that was a formal request to get expenses that are consent decree related versus expenses for regular operating.
Okay, Councilwoman, let's get some clarification on that. We're talking about the entire scope of the fiscal year 22 budget?
Yes.
And I think this is Commissioner Councilperson. I think there is some overlap there, because there are going to be operating costs, especially when it comes to technology, that overlap with the technology requirements of the consent decree. But there are just regular operating costs that there may be some overlap. I think there is a way to bifurcate that and separate that out.
I understand that there could be overlap because one of the, like using technology as your example.
Councilwoman, can I jump in real quick? Because I just want to make sure we nail down this request for you.
Thank you.
I want to jump over to Solicitor Shea for a moment, because I know I've heard in the past from law and police that there is a lot of overlap here. So Solicitor Shea, can you speak to whether or not it's kind of cut and dry that this stuff is operating and this stuff is consent decree related, or is it much more complicated than that? What's your take on it?
Well, there's some examples that are easy. There are fees that are paid to the monitoring team that are clearly only consent decree. But there are a lot that are both. Training, take training, for example. We are doing special training, but we should be doing special training. That becomes part of the operation of the department. But I think what the commissioner is saying is we can identify where there's overlap, and then you can start to make some judgments about if there's more because of the consent decree, how much more. So it's going to end up being subjective in part, and I think the councilwoman probably knows that. She'd like to be able to see that.
Okay, and Councilwoman, just in terms of thinking of the most efficient way to do this, would you be amenable to a meeting with, let's start with Ms. Graham from BPD and someone from BBMR to have a conversation and kind of go through each service area in each line item, and then depending on the extent to which that adequately satisfies what your request is, then asking for something directly in writing. And I don't mean to create an extra step, but I just want to make sure that the intent of your request is addressed before we send the agency off and have them put together something in writing that isn't, in the format of kind of what you envisioned your answer looking like.
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with doing a preliminary meeting and then getting what we want in writing. That's totally fine. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so before I go back to you for your other question, Councilwoman, so Michelle and Nina, the request here from Councilwoman Ramos is that we're going to get a conversation for her with Ms. Graham from BPD, a joint conversation along with either Bob Seneme or someone from his team at BBMR. Everyone good on that? And we'll include the chief of staff for the commissioner, Mr. Melanson. Is that everyone good with that? Okay. All right, excellent. Back to you, Councilwoman. Thank you for being amenable to that. I just want to make sure your question's addressed adequately.
Sure, and I appreciate your time doing that, and it's probably better to do it that way so we don't take so much time here. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner, for being willing to do that exercise as well. My second question is a budget question on page 228 of the budget book under service 635, which is the training, the recruitment process. It says here, new recruits, activity 006, $19 million, and it's significantly higher than the past couple of years. What is that? Is that for actually training new recruits, or is that for recruiting new recruits?
Thank you. Great question. I'm going to ask my chief financial officer to come in and talk to you about that, because there's some nuance there that requires a little explaining.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for the question. And yes, to answer your question, that is specifically for the new recruits. So those are for the positions for the new recruits. So what we've done is just taken some vacancies and put them and realign them in the new recruits to make sure we have enough positions to bring the recruits into training. So last year we had 144 positions in there, and then this year we put 184 positions. There's no cost increase, it's just realigning for where we need the positions.
So if I understand correctly, and I hope you'll indulge me a second, Mr. Chair. So this 19 million is a transfer from other parts of the police budget just to say that this is the cost of new recruits for this year, and it's 100 and how many?
It's 184 positions, and yes, that's correct. So what happens with the new recruits? We used to move their positions with them to patrol, but now with Workday, we do position management, so we keep the positions set. So it's not really changing anything, it's just changing how we account for the positions.
So they were moved from patrol. Is that what the money was moved from patrol into recruits? And so you have it specifically there. Okay.
That's correct. And it's not a change to patrol. It's just because the recruits, they cycle into patrol to do field training. So previously they would take that position with them. And now we're budgeting it to say, hey, you know, we're keeping the positions in new recruits, and then they will transfer into a different position in patrol. So it's just the way we're accounting for the positions to be a little bit more transparent.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'll have to look at this. And I'll ask my other questions when it's my turn again. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Hang tight for 30 seconds, please. Okay, real quick, do we have Councilman Bullock on the line? Okay, do we have Councilman Glover on the line? Okay, we're going to jump to Council President Mosby, and then we're going to take a brief recess. Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In line with the questions I asked earlier, just really focusing, Mr. Commissioner, on these like hard fixed costs that we know we saw an increase. When we talk about this year, we talk about workers' comp and the increase that we see there. Do we know what that's a result of? Like, are we tracking that data? I know nationally there seems to be a trend in that department, but is there anything more granular specific to BPD where we're seeing an increase associated with workers' comp?
Hi, this is Bob Sedemy. I can take this one since this one's more of a central allocated cost. So yeah, what for workers' comp, the way we budget for that is we actually have an actuary that comes in and reviews the city's all the city's outstanding risks, including for employee injuries and workers' comp. And they look at trends both on historical injuries, rate of injury, and what the cost for, you know, either lost work time or medical liability for those injuries is. And they also do an assessment of just our general risk exposure. In other words, more forward-looking, what is the potential risk of employees being injured going forward? So that number comes from the actuary. They do a deep analysis. I know that there's a couple things that have happened here. First, historically, our costs have grown over the last 5 years. There have been additional medical claims in the police department. So the actuary has taken that into account and said you need to budget more for that on an annual basis. There's also a trend that's affecting all frontline employees is that, you know, during COVID-19, they're at more risk, you know, especially folks like police officers or folks in fire or AFSCME, some of our frontline workers. And that's more of a general across the board trend that there's more risk for our frontline workers, especially this year, given the exposure and potential sickness from COVID-19. So some of it is historical police, you know, historical claims data that gets rolled in, but some of it is just a general allocation to reflect the fact that we do have more risk for our frontline employees this year, especially.
Understood. I guess, Bob and team, similar to the questions around the settlements and the payouts there, I assume that we haven't done any longitudinal like analysis associated with these workers' claims, as well as the same individuals who are involved in some of these payouts. The assumption is probably we have not done any of that analysis, right?
Well, I would say the actuarial report that we get, which we can certainly share, does go into some level of detail about the types of claims that we've seen historically in different agencies. They break it down by they do break it down by the larger agencies. So there's a breakout for police and for fire and for public works and for other large agencies. So I don't know if I would characterize that as a longitudinal study, but there is a fair amount of data. And again, that data gets dropped from our risk management shop to their analyst, and they run the data and they look at the trends over a long period of time. So I'm happy to share that report with you if you're interested in it.
Well, definitely interested in that report, and I think Andy Smullian is on. I appreciate the data that you provided me associated with the pensions through the police department, but I'm really interested in taking a further drill down on and conflating the workers' comp with the officers that have created liability for the city. So looking at it through that 10-year period, really interested in trying to understand that correlation. So definitely, Bob, when you have that information to provide, I truly appreciate it. Do we know the number of like claims that we've received over a certain time period? Is that something that you would have, Bob? Would that be in that information that you're going to provide me?
It is in the annual report, so we can provide that to you, and there is the data in that report.
And then lastly, is there any action specific to BPD that we've done in the past that we've seen results in to reduce the number of claims year over year? Again, I mean, Bob, my whole focus is just really looking at like these hard fixed costs. How can we, develop systems and policies and procedures to try to drive them down? So just wondering from a workers' claims perspective, has there been any fruit that we've been able to uncover to help reduce workers' comp claims?
Well, I think from an internal perspective, Mr. President, we well over a year ago created what's called the Administrative Duties Division, where we take all of the officers who are either slightly injured or recovering from a serious injury and can't work at all, and they are assigned to that division while they recover. And the goal is to work and to manage that, to make sure they're all centrally located to manage, so that we can help them with their rehabilitation and help them to get back to work much faster. And it has helped us account for having sufficient personnel in the field, account for overtime costs with the way we were managing overtime, even with people who are out injured, sometimes working overtime. We've corrected that. But just knowing where everybody is and how to help people get recovery and get back to work, and accountability for those who are limited duty and are rehabbing while they work to recover to come back to work.
Got it. The last thing I'll say is, Mr. Commissioner, I don't know if we've been in a council budget hearing we're at 2.5 hours where we haven't brought up overtime. And I think that's a testament to the hard work that you've been doing to try to structurally drive down what we've always seen in the past is it's like fixed costs of an expanding and growing overtime budget. So I guess when you do good work, you don't necessarily hear about it, but I wanted to kind of mention and bring that up. If there's anything that you can talk to us about real quick on that as it relates to overtime, I know you've been squeezing a lot of juice out of that orange, and I know going to workday is probably kind of going to get us to the pinnacle of that, but do you see any additional projections in being able to reduce overtime? And again, this is off of the strength of you doing such an amazing job over the past couple of years.
I appreciate that. Had I known we weren't going to discuss it, I probably wouldn't have brought it up. But since thank you. But since I did, thank you. And I think Workday is going to help. With the technology with Workday, it's going to help us move away from this manual process of officers handing in paper overtime slips with pay clerks, entering them, and they weren't being reconciled for 2 weeks until the next pay cycle rolled around. And then officers were turning them in late, were working overtime at will instead of asking permission and then permission being granted for whatever reason, and not for the goals that the department set for why overtime should be worked and against the allocation that each district was given. And so we have now corrected that by putting those protocols in place to make officers ask permission, supervisors grant authority for it according to the goals and according to the allocation given to each district. But we also put a cap on how many hours an officer can work in a week, and making sure that we keep officers under that cap. Number one, to keep them healthy so that they're always well rested and prepared for the next shift's work, but also to make sure that we have accountability and making sure we're then checking supervisors that they're actually supervising and approving or declining overtime as according to the goals we set. I think now that we have Workday and some technology, we'll improve on it even more, because we'll be able to know always in real time what the dollar amount is for each week, instead of having it being reconciled 2 weeks after the pay period. So I don't know that there's more cost savings, but there's more accountability and transparency there.
Thank you. And Bob, you would know just quickly where we seen the reduction, including like some of the supplementals that went to police overtime in the past. You wouldn't know where we are in the past couple of years as it relates to the delta, again, where we are today versus where we were a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I can say that, pre this administration, I'm referring to the police department administration. I mean, we were in the habit of, we would have to ask for sometimes $20 million supplementals each year for the overtime spend. And, under this, new team, they've come down significantly just over the past 2 years. So we spent over 50 million just 2 years ago in fiscal 2019. In fiscal 21, we're on track to spend about 32 or so, give or take. And we're nearing the end of the fiscal year. So I think we feel pretty confident that we're going to come in at a much, much lower level than even just 2 years ago. So that has been a drastic improvement. The police department has been, much closer, kind of hitting their target. And, I think those days of us coming and asking for, tens of millions of dollars of supplementals is over. I do want to caution that in a year like this with COVID, there are, things that can come up that are somewhat out of the department's control that they might have to respond to, either some kind of, public health emergency or a protest or something like that, where they have additional resources allocated. Special events sometimes are things that they might have to allocate additional resources to on overtime. So we do look at those numbers each pay period. And, they have a target of about 1.1 million per pay period that they've been working off of this year, and they've hit it most of the pay periods, with the exception of those times. And there's been something that I think, to be fair to them, is completely out of their control.
So Commissioner Harrison, and to your team, again, thank you for your leadership on that issue. I don't think it gets highlighted enough. Truly, truly appreciate it. And Bob, I look forward to seeing that actuarial analysis.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Chair, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is now 9:08 p.m. We're going to take a 15-minute recess. So we will come back no earlier than 9:23 p.m. But realistically, we're going to be back in about 30 minutes at 9:38 p.m. So at the earliest, we will be back at 9:23 p.m. So I'm going to ask all agency officials and council members to be back online by 9:23 p.m. We're now in recess. Okay, Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee, we are back in session for City Council Bill 21-0080, the ordinance of estimates for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. Bear with me one moment. Colleagues, I'm going to ask that everyone turn their cameras back on. Commissioner Harrison, I'm going to ask that everyone from your department turn their cameras back on. The only folks that this does not apply to are Mayor's Office of Government Relations staff, City Council President staff, and Bureau of Budget and Management Research staff. Everyone else, please turn your cameras back on. City Council colleagues, Police Department personnel, please turn your cameras back on. Okay, well, got a critical mass of about as much as we're going to get here. Okay. Give deference to the, we're going to go back to the council president for another round of questions. If you have, Mr. President.
No, I do have some more questions, but Mr. Chair, I'll just wait for the round robin again.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to skip myself for the moment and I'll jump back in out of order. Councilwoman McCray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, the International City County Management Association applies the rule of 60 to evaluate police department staffing, allocation, and deployment, which states that 60% of all police staffing should be within police patrol functions. Our department is budgeted for 1,549 patrol positions. Of that number, how many people are accurately assigned and working in patrol operations as of today?
Thank you for that. We'll be able to give that to you and give you a breakdown of that. My Chief of Staff is prepared to answer that.
So currently, the estimates can be provided. I know the Chief of Patrol's office tracks this on a weekly basis. And so I know operations could probably provide the figure from this past Monday. But overall, it's approximately 720 that are assigned to patrol from the officer rank. And there's approximately 100 or so from the sergeant's rank, and then 27 or so from the lieutenant's rank. And then, of course, there's command staff at the captain and major level, in addition to support personnel for all of the districts. Those are folks who are managing calls for service activity. So it really depends on how you define patrol. But I would defer to the Chief of Patrol, who is on here, Kevin Jones, to give a little bit more specificity if my numbers are off.
No, sir, you're pretty much right on. So in reference to patrol police officers are 779. The full duty assigned sergeants are 133. And for the sergeants, the committed assigned is 27. Of course, taking into consideration, you have each district has a district commander and a captain. So yes.
And just to clarify, council member, there's also other functions beyond just those catching for calls for service, correct, Colonel?
Correct, sir. So within the district boundaries, you're going to have your district detective unit, which is staffed with a lieutenant, several sergeants, and detectives. You're going to have your district action team, which is going to have at least one sergeant, two if they have two DAT teams. You also have districts that have allocated themselves, either like the central district, who has a bike unit, harbor unit. Some districts have a foot squad. Some districts have, all districts have NCO services, which is your neighborhood coordinating officers, which is normally one sergeant and two or three. Plus, you have an admin staff of sergeant and two officers.
And so we could provide that allocation breakdown as of last Monday to your office. We'll make sure that Michelle gets you that request, council member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I make that a formal request, please?
Yes, ma'am. Can you just summarize that in one sentence, Councilwoman?
Yes. Can I have the full amount for the patrol that's out right now, as of today?
Yeah, that's what we call a patrol strength report, and we can provide that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nina, what is that? 77, 6, 78. Time flies when you're having fun. Councilwoman?
Thank you. When the conversation started around civilianization a few years ago, the goal was to get to 20% of the department civilianized. Percentage-wise, where are we at today with that plan?
Approximately 19.5%, actually. Part of the goal, however, is to try to find more avenues for civilianization. We have been postponing a lot of those projects due to budget reductions that we've had to manage because of COVID, because of Kerwin investments. We've gone through a couple of exercises where we had to freeze civilian positions because of those budget deficit realities that we've had to overcome. And so we have that staffing plan measure of 20% in the long-term goal of our department, but as of right now, it's approximately 19.5%, and I can have HR again provide you with more specific information subsequent to this meeting, but that was, last I checked at the beginning of this month, was about 19.5%.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Schleifer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize if this question is too similar to Councilwoman Ramos's question, but going back to one of the first meetings we had as new council people 5 years ago with that council that was coming in, was a meeting with the law department talking about the consent decree. And there was, estimated budgeting cost about what the entire thing would cost. And if I recall correctly, the lion's share of that was on cloud storage as it pertained to body camera footage and other things along those lines. So my question is really, is there any estimated cost that we've incurred on the consent decree? Is that ever part of the conversation about what the just ballpark figure is for that item?
I think we have a breakdown of what it costs for the body camera program in global, what it is for the equipment, the storage, the maintenance, the warranty. I don't know that it's necessarily a line item for a consent decree, because we also have the RMS, which is the technology improvement. Whether we had the consent decree or not, we were going to have this new RMS program and the learning management program and a number of other technologies that we are either have now or embarking upon that the department has to have and need, whether it's a consent decree mandate or not. And I think we can give you the total numbers of what those items cost to buy and to manage. I don't know that it comes to you as a consent decree cost, but a technology cost.
Gotcha. So there's no like ballpark figure to say that, because when they told us originally, they did have a ballpark figure of what they thought it would cost in general to implement a lot of these things that the consent decree was requiring. But if that's the information you have, I'll take that when you guys can produce that. But I am curious to know if there is a figure, if we're talking about, this is a 30 million, 50 million, $100 million figure, that kind of estimate.
We can certainly get that and meet with the monitoring team, the Department of Justice, and if there's a cost that was affixed to the consent decree upon the signing of it, and we can certainly get that and report back. And then we can tell you what the technology costs are that that cost for us to have the technology we have, whether it's a consent decree mandate or not.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Council Vice President Middleton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the same question I posed to the fire department, and you were also first responders. We're definitely still in an opioid epidemic, and the police, I'm sure, distribute Narcan on emergencies. Do you have data of how much is distributed in each neighborhood? And I kind of ask that so we can kind of get a grasp of the areas that really need help with drug abuse. It would be nice to have data. I know the fire department said that they work with the health department with that, and we know that there are some privacy things, but generally we just need information on Narcan distribution and where in our neighborhoods are the repeat, some people, they get it 3, 4, 9 times in a given period. And we want to hone in and try to help the neighborhood.
Absolutely. So we do administer Narcan, and we do track data as a department, but I'll let either the Chief of Patrol's office or the Deputy Commissioner of Operations talk about if we break it down that far district by district.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Harrison. Thank you for that question. That's a really good question. Vice Chair Middleton, we do track that. We track what we distribute to our officers from patrol. We also track the number of calls for service. I can tell you in terms of overdose response thus far this year, we've responded to approximately 1,700 overdose calls for service, but I would have to get you the solid number in terms of administrations that we've been able to deliver to the citizens of Baltimore.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate that data. And then my second question, during the pandemic, there has been just a whole lot of calls with, and I'm sure you get them too, with speeding through, side streets have increased in our neighborhoods, and people call us wanting traffic calming devices. And of course, there's a process. And part of that process is, that I think the police department is involved in is that response time going to affect you basically sign off at some point. Do you have someone assigned to that, or is it, is there a particular person that works with Department of Transportation when that issue comes in?
So
Go ahead, Colonel.
yeah, this is Colonel Jones. So yeah, we do have a traffic unit that does handle that. We do have specific lieutenant and a sergeant in that unit that handles those calls for service in reference to traffic. So normally they do work with in reference to those calming studies, or when the council's men will reach into the districts and ask the district commanders for calming studies. We are more than willing to give the data that we do have.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Commissioner, I'm going to jump in to take my question I passed on before. I want to jump to Service 816, Special Operations, specifically Activity 7, Aviation. Can you have someone from your team talk to where we're at in terms of staffing for the aviation unit, and specifically if there's any vacancies?
Absolutely. Thank you. We reduced the staffing there last year, but I'll let either patrol or my chief of staff talk about the positions that are vacant there now.
Yeah, why don't I give that over to the chief of patrol while I look up some of the budget figures if needed. But I do know that there are a number of vacant flight officer positions that we've had to leave vacant, again, due to, budget restrictions. There's some complexity in terms of putting on an academy for flight officers specifically. But again, I would defer to the chief of patrol on some of the reduction in flight hours that were incorporated into last year's, or excuse me, the current year budget, and where we are with that. So, Colonel Jones.
Yep, copy, sir. So I do believe that we are slated for 7 flight officers. Right now, we are currently at 4. So that translates into a reduction in our flight time. I know I made a request today of our aviation unit of pushing back the late night flight plan from 5 to 1 to a 7 to 3. So they're going to make some alterations to that because of some of the late night issues that we've been seeing throughout the city. But there is a issue with filling those vacancies at this time.
And what are Colonel Jones or Chief Melanson, can you talk about what we're doing to ensure that that unit is staffed appropriately at 7?
So specifically to what the Major Webb is doing for that unit, I would have to reach out to him and follow up with you specifically what he has done, implemented in reference to getting those numbers up to staffing study said they should be.
Okay. Can we set up a phone call for me and Major Webb and Colonel Jones for sometime next week for a 15-minute phone call I would ask that BPD do everything humanly possible to appropriately staff that unit. That Foxtrot is one of the most effective tools that we have in terms of fighting crime, but also in terms of keeping citizens safe, keeping officers safe, and frankly, de-escalating situations that could be a lot crazier. And I think it's a very effective tool in helping with compliance with the consent decree. That's just my personal opinion. There's 14 other members here, but I would ask that we do everything humanly possible to staff that appropriately.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to jump to Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first question I had was around Service 628, the Public Integrity Bureau. So the target for this year or last year, fiscal year, in this coming fiscal year, as far as investigations completed within 6 months, is at 60%. But they're also, the actual has declined pretty significantly over that same period of time, with a significant budget increase, including salary. Can we just speak to what the plan is to actually hit the target, and what the actual increase is associated with as far as the budget allocation for that line item?
Yeah, sure. Deputy Commissioner Nato.
Yes. Thank you, sir, for the question. So we're currently at 36% completion within 6 months. We're trying to get to the 60%. Of course, under the consent decree, we have to do these cases quicker. We understand why we need to get them done quicker. It's not good for any member to have a case hanging over their head. It's certainly not good for any citizen to file a complaint and have it wait for a lengthy period of time. So we are moving further in that direction by increasing the number of detectives in PIB to do those cases. So we are currently at 36%. We're hoping to get to 60% by the end of the year.
And is that the increase is associated with the transfer of detectives?
So we'll go to Shala for the increase.
Yes, good
There's a
afternoon
$3
again.
million bump from the
Yes.
previous year.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yes, you are correct, sir. So the increase is associated with an increase in authorized positions. So if you compare last year's authorized positions of 54 for the Service of Public Integrity Bureau, the increase this year to 72, so that's 18 additional positions. And that is what the increase is.
Okay. Yeah, more. It sounds like there does need to be more manpower there. If folks are, over almost 90% of the cases are stretching beyond that period. The second question I had for this round, Mr. Chair, was Service 622 notes there's an additional, at least from my understanding, it looks like there's an additional 25 officers dedicated to foot patrol in that line item, or that service item. I don't know if I'm saying it the right way, sorry. But I was trying to figure out, or maybe this is a data request. One, am I interpreting that correctly? And if so, is this a part of that summer deployment foot patrol plan that was referred to earlier?
So, Councilmember, actually the 25 state-funded positions dedicated to foot patrol is actually a continuous line item that has been provided by the state through its grant allocation. So that is a continuous level of service that has been carried over effectively for the last several years. The state provides that block allocation for personnel costs associated with expanding our capacity for community policing and community engagement, and it includes officers being dedicated to foot patrol. So that's a continuous line of service item, not a new item.
Got it. Okay. Those are my two, Mr. Chair. I'll come back. I do have a couple more.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Dorsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say it's putting it lightly to say that most of what I hear from constituents about police is that they don't seem to get any bang for their buck, and that across the board, everybody seems to think that if at the very least Baltimore police did some traffic enforcement of the maniacs driving cars all around the city, that at least that would be something productive coming from this budget. What does this budget do to increase enforcement of traffic laws in the city?
Well, I think first of all, thank you. And as officers observe violations, officers are conducting traffic stops. They're doing traffic investigations. As a matter of fact, we're 30% up in the number of guns we've taken off the street this year compared to last year. And the majority of them come from traffic enforcement stops where officers are actually observing traffic violations and taking the appropriate action, thus leading them to the seizure of an increased number of guns that were taken off the street. So some of that work is actually being done, and coupled with the human component, working with the technological component that is designed to deter traffic violations and alter traffic driving behavior. This budget allows us to, number one, continue to fight crime, continue to go after violent offenders, continue to use traffic enforcement as one of the means by which we're engaging in the crime fight, but officers are actually performing that work. More officers, more free time to do that proactive work is what this budget allows for.
Is there any way to quantify that answer in any way?
I don't know that I can at this very second, but I think we can talk about the number of traffic enforcement or traffic engagements you see per district and as a department per day, per week. Those numbers we do collect and can provide that for you.
Then I would like to absolutely request that formally. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Councilman, go back and summarize that real quick.
The department's going to provide a report of the account of traffic related enforcement actions taken per district on what, a weekly basis?
That information is provided to us, and we are able to look at especially vehicle stops and enforcement actions taken regarding traffic violations. I think we collect that data because we talk about it at ComStat every Thursday. So we believe there's a way to quantify that, at least in some way, to provide that for you.
Councilman, real quick. So you're saying by week, but is there a time range? Like, are you saying by week over a 6-month period, or what do you, please clarify.
How long has the department been tracking this?
We've been tracking this for a while, sir. So what we can probably do just to make it easier for us is we could break it down from a 28-day, which is our month. We can give you the 28-day, we can give you the year-to-date each district. And the specialized units like traffic reduction team, accident reduction team that can have some enforcement capacity as well.
Does that work for you, Councilman?
Yeah, I would ask, is there an ability to continuously provide this information, like on a biweekly basis?
Well, Councilman, let me jump in and push back a little bit. Would you be amenable to a 28-day basis, just based on their month?
I mean, I think that seems reasonable.
Colonel Jones?
Yes, sir. We can do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Second question.
Yeah, just real quick, I think this would be an appropriate moment for me to say that I'm really grateful to the department for providing me on-time information every month on or there about the first of every month for the entire last year on the assignment of officers, and I think that that information has gotten better during that period of time, indicating to me that it probably was of value to the department to have to provide it each month. So I just really appreciate the department making good on the request that the chair helped me to iterate so clearly last year. And that ability to do that was in no small part due to great work from Michelle Wurzberger and Eric Melanson. So thank you both so much, and everybody else that's helped support that.
Thank you.
I don't know how to pose the next question that I want to ask, and I don't want to make a speech, but
Councilman, do you want to take a minute to chew on it? I'll go to another council member and I'll come back to you immediately after.
No, I'm just going to make a very brief statement if I could.
Please.
I have a real problem with encrypting radios so that people cannot listen to continue to scan the police waves. I think that there is a valuable public interest and journalistic interest in allowing people unreservedly and unqualifiedly to be able to observe what's happening in deployment and in calls for service. And I'm going to just plead here that the department reconsider and not discontinue the free availability of scanning, that it not become encrypted. And I want to thank citizen journalists and people who are highly civically engaged, like the people running Scan the Police on Twitter. Thank you.
Hey, Councilman Dorsey, just real quick, I just got an update. So what I could give you is year to date, in reference to car stops, there was 27,000 car stops executed by this agency.
Thank you.
Hang on one second. What's that? Councilman Dorsey, you're good?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Councilman. I'm going to jump out of order. No offense to Chairman Conway, but I said I would do committee members first, and I had inadvertently skipped over Councilman Stokes. And then I'll get right back to our order to Chairman Conway. Councilman Stokes.
I have no questions, sir. I'm good.
Thank you, sir. Councilman Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief because it's past 10 o'clock. I know everybody wants to go to sleep soon. My first question has to do with the Crime Lab Service 642. The first performance measured here is the number of days to eradicate existing backlog in all units combined. What does that mean?
Good evening, Councilman. Thank you for the question. So historically, the crime lab's various sections, latent print unit, firearms unit, biology section, drug analysis unit, have all carried a backlog due to the volume. So that metric is referring to being able to reduce or eliminate that backlog. And we've been able to make big strides in some of those areas with some innovative techniques and resource allocation.
Wouldn't it be maybe more helpful to just track the average days to process evidence?
Yes and no, it would, but a lot of the evidence that we have is very old. So if we've got, for example, we take cases in order of priority, homicides first, sex offenses next, or order of priority. So older cases or less property crimes, for example, will not take priority over a personal crime. So those cases may stack up, and over years and years of building those backlogs, now that we're getting additional, or now that we have additional personnel and we've innovated some new techniques and some new methods of doing things, validated methods of doing things, we're able to eliminate those. So while we can track our calls for service, our those metrics, some of them aren't able to be tracked as easily. For example, firearms evidence is processed within 24 hours. So we will get cartridge cases from firearms, and that will be put into NIVIN, and the investigators will have a lead within 24 hours. Some of the other cases, such as handgun violations, if we've got a busy weekend and there's lots of firearms coming in, those may not get processed as fast as the violent crime cases.
Yeah, I think, and I'll move on to my next one after I say this, but I think, of course, it seems like you guys understand that getting a hit quickly on a piece of evidence is incredibly important towards making an arrest, usually. So in some way, I think it would be helpful for us to track, maybe for part one crimes or priority crimes, whatever we may call it, the average amount of time to address those, and maybe not lumping everything into our backlog, because you kind of lose the experience of time. The more recent crimes that we probably have much more of a chance on, as opposed to something that may be years old, but is still just in the backlog for the crime lab. I'll move on to my second question, and this should be a simpler one. This is for the special operations section, and the performance measure is the percentage of costs reimbursed by special event organizers. And the target is 100%. It always has been, but the actual is 74%. Why aren't we able to be fully compensated from our special events?
I can answer that. So, council member, that's a great question. Part of what we've been trying to make sure of first begins with the amount that we bill for what it is that we're using for special events. We just had an initiative passed by the Board of Estimates this last week, excuse me, that helps equalize those costs, and that's a big portion of it. We were essentially only billing out $45 an hour, when the actual cost of that overtime dollar for the officers is closer to $60 to $65 an hour. So we realigned for a better cost recovery. We actually received a report from the city auditor on this exact issue that you're talking about. And so following those recommendations, we are looking at a better cost recovery, but that's just part of the puzzle. The other puzzle is people paying their invoices, essentially, and making sure that we're being diligent in how those collections are being done. We partner with the Department of Finance on those and those operations because they are centrally managed. But for us, it's a question of making sure we've got the right number of folks on those events and that we're billing it out correctly as part of that permitting process.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'd love to sort of, and of course we can do this outside of this hearing, but get a little insight as to how that could even happen. Of course, we're out there, we're serving, we're making sure everyone is safe. Do folks pay in advance, or do they pay after? If they don't pay after, what are the means of that? We don't need to explore that here, but I'm really curious about it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Torrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's getting late. I'm going to only ask one question, and this question is really related to equity, especially with having homegrown officers. My question is, I just want to actually, I won't even belabor it. I'm just going to make it a request. That way we can move forward. I would like to know the recruitment efforts that we've made in terms of community-based organizations in Baltimore to recruit residents in the city. And I say that because one of the things that I've noticed in other departments, they built pipelines of young people in their cities to actually create their police force to match the number of residents. I want to know how we're doing it or what plans we will have to do it, because I do know we had the cadet program and from the advocacy of Councilman Burnett and others. But I remember the Explorer program. I remember the PAL centers. How are we actually going to recruit people who actually live here in Baltimore City?
Well, very good point. And what I'd like to do is jump in there really quickly, even though you didn't, it's a request, and you didn't put it in the form of a question. We have a digital marketing campaign that we partner with a local advertising company here in Baltimore to help us accomplish those goals of hiring more minorities, hiring more people from Baltimore, and more women in the Baltimore Police Department. And in 2020, we were successful in all three of those demographics. And it's showing up in this year's hiring as well. And so that digital marketing campaign was strategically designed to go after those three demographics. And we had an increase in the percentages in all three of those demographics. We'd be more than happy to give you that and show you how that works for us and how we're strategically targeting more people from the city.
Councilman Torrance, would you like that request satisfied in writing, or would you prefer a meeting?
Both, please.
Okay, can we start with the meeting and then see where that goes, and then you can clarify what your written request will be after you have that discussion with BPD?
If I can have something preliminary beforehand so I can read it to make sure I'm clear. I just want to make sure I'm going in with
absolutely
enough questions to clarify. So
okay.
Any type of reporting PowerPoint presentation beforehand would be perfect, and then I'll follow up with a more explicit X.
And Commissioner, who's going to be the appropriate colonel or major that oversees this?
That's going to be Deputy Commissioner Jim Gillis.
Okay, so Nina, what number are we at? 80. Councilman Torrance, your raffle ticket number 80.
Thank you.
Can we get something in writing and a narrative? And feel free to attach any appropriate collateral that might exist. Social media flyer, ad campaign, PowerPoint, whatever. And then request 81 will be a meeting with Deputy Commissioner Gillis with Councilman Torrance to discuss that after the fact.
I have to take the opportunity to plug bpdrecruit.org for anybody listening within the sound of my voice. bpdrecruit.org. But yes, we will ensure all of those things are provided.
Thank you. So that's 80 for the documentation and 81 for the meeting request. Okay. Councilman Torrance, back to you, sir.
That is all I have. Time to put the kid to sleep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you, Commissioner, and to your team. I remain concerned about the amount of times I see officers sitting in cars and not seeming to do as much police work as I would hope for, given the level of violence in our city. Especially strikes me on a day where our schools had to close because of no air conditioning. We're paying a lot of money to officers that are still sitting around in cars. What are we doing as a department to monitor the amount of time that officers are stationary in cars? And I don't mean driving through neighborhoods or doing sort of patrol, but could you walk me through how we are supervising and monitoring officers on the street that are sitting in vehicles, not out, not engaging with community?
Yeah, I think all of us share that same concern, and I've heard that complaint this week. I've heard that complaint every week for the more than 2 years I've been here. But we put a lot of emphasis on making sure the officers are out of the cars, that they're doing foot patrols, that they're doing business checks, that they're doing directed patrols, that they're doing community engagement and actually engaging with community members, whether it's pre-COVID or whether it's during COVID. That's the expectation that we have, and we monitor that every week in CompStat, and we produce measures of accountability where we can compel the commanders to show and to answer why either their foot patrols are low or their business checks are low, or why they're doing or to compliment them when they're doing a good job. What I can tell you is that in one of our police stat models, we had an opportunity to actually use a CCTV camera to look at one of the officers in a particular block who claimed he was out doing a foot patrol and business checks, and what we found that was actually not, was sitting in a car or just driving behind the place and not actually getting out as reported. And so there are disciplinary measures, training measures and disciplinary measures for when we find that officers are reporting that they're doing it and that are not, and that there's accountability to be held for supervisors who are failing to supervise, and to make sure officers are actually getting out of the car and doing that. Those are things we preach and teach and talk about every single day. But as we work to reduce the burdens, to make sure supervisors are not bound to that district station and that computer, and we can get them out in the field to do more supervising, that's exactly what we want supervisors to do. And not just to make sure they get out of the car, but we want to know what's being done about it when we find that they're in the car when they actually need to be out of the car. But going forward, now that we have this digital system coming online with the records management system, the officers will be writing their reports from the computer in the car. So although we want them out of the car more for community engagement, that's exactly what we want. And we want them on foot patrols. Some of the work that they're going back to the station to do in the handwritten police reports, they're actually going to be doing that from within the car. Now that's a legitimate assignment while in the car. But when not on that assignment, we absolutely want officers out the car, and we want supervisors doing something about it when they find that they're in that car for no legitimate reason when they should be out.
Okay, and so you've developed specific metrics that you test at CompStat, that you test against in terms of percent of time in the car, business checks. Like, are there actual metrics that you all utilize, or is it just sort of, could you explain that a little more in terms of what that piece in CompStat looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's broken down into directed patrol, business checks, foot patrol, traffic stops, and it's a couple of other metrics, and we can see the percentages by district where they're showing the percentage of time spent on that activity. And then we challenge commanders to explain why perhaps week after week their numbers are low in one particular area, but perhaps high in another area, or in low in multiple areas. Sometimes there are valid explanations, and sometimes we believe that they're not. But then, that then falls on us as executives to create measures of accountability through training and discipline for even supervisors and command members when we find that happens. But yeah, those are metrics that we look at, and it's what it looks like is percentage of time spent on a particular activity. And some of the activity is activity out of the car. For example, traffic stops may not be an activity out of the car, but business checks, community engagement, and foot patrols are activities that are outside of the car, and we can see the percentage of time spent broken down by district each week.
Great. Yeah, I frequently get texts from constituents, and I myself see officers sitting in cars, and it frustrates me and it frustrates our constituents. And we understand that sometimes you have to be in there, but it remains a concern. Commissioner, my second question, I do want to acknowledge and thank you and your team for really being steadfast in not supporting some of the worst elements of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, and being really clear in your own messaging that we are not looking to turn anyone over to ICE, that we are welcoming, that we're supportive of all of our communities. That being said, we still, even in this last year where we no longer have a president who is openly hostile to our immigrant community, we've still seen a really large amount of violent crime perpetrated against our Central American and South American immigrant community in Southeast Baltimore, and really, I think, throughout the city. Many of the crimes go unreported. I know anecdotally from pastors and community leaders that folks are still very afraid to report to police. I want to thank Michelle, who's been helping to coordinate some conversations with BPD in our district to try to improve those relationships. But I want to know at a department level, what are we doing to increase faith among our immigrant community that we support them and that we are not a federal agency that is interested in deporting them? Because when crimes occur and they go unreported, that is a huge, huge problem because we know it's going to happen again and again and again.
Well, thank you. And as often as we can, we're happy to engage at any invitation with members of the Hispanic community to, number one, to reinforce our commitment to what you just said. The Baltimore Police Department's immigration policy was my second policy, which I implemented and had written and implemented in the very first weeks I was here, only second to the body camera release policy. Those were the first two in my very first weeks. We remain committed to this day to that policy, which is probably one of the most robust in all of the United States. But as often as we can, we're happy to engage. And certainly there's always room for improvement on our communication strategy to all communities about our commitment, especially to that policy and to that commitment. And so in our training, in our community policing training that is forthcoming for all members of the department this summer, about how to engage, what engagement really looks like, those are the kind of conversations that get discussed, the immigration policy, because that's, the officers have to be aware and cognizant that they have to adjust their communications to make sure we're getting the message out to all communities. And there are different things that are sometimes needed based on where we are and with whom we're engaging. And so, look, we remain committed, and with your help, as often as we can get that message out to the leaders of the community to reinforce that message, we're happy to do it.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I think that more needs to be done on that front, just department wide. I do think language access barriers and how we communicate is critically important. But again, appreciate your stance on that. And thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do we still have Councilwoman Porter with us? All right, let's jump to Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Commissioner. Thanks for sticking with us. I had a question related to Councilman Conway's earlier question about retirements and people leaving the department. We had a hearing in our Public Safety and Government Operations Committee a few months ago about recruitment, but also retention. And I had asked for data about, you have great data, or you gave us great data about, who we're recruiting and what the class looks like and all of that. But we didn't have any for people leaving, and we wanted to know race, age, and retiring, or whether it was somebody voluntarily leaving. So I guess admittedly, Ms. Wurzberger Director Wurzberger did give me some of that data earlier in the evening, but maybe to add to Councilman Conway's request for the exit interview data, to also get data around race, age, not race, age, race and gender, and also reason for leaving, because that would help us with understanding in terms of what's going on with retention.
Thank you, Councilmember. We talk about that every single Monday in my executive team meeting, and my HR director reports out on the actual numbers. While it's not broken down into age and race, it is.
I didn't mean age. I'm sorry. I meant gender and race.
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
It's not broken down into gender. Although we have that data and we can produce it. We talk about that every Monday morning about the numbers and who's leaving and for what reasons. It's usually broken down to me in years of service. What are the number of years, the range of people leaving, and to the extent they're honest on their exit interview, the reasons why. And so that's we can certainly break that down and get that for you especially in at least what's given to me every week.
Thanks. So, Mr. Chair, I guess that would be an amendment to Conway's earlier, or would that be a fresh request?
Summarize it for me in a sentence, Councilwoman, please, and thank you.
Certainly.
Summarize it. Yep.
Sure. We're looking at the number of people leaving the department by, where they are in where they were in the department when they left, by race and gender.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to go on mute for a second. All right, perfect. So, Councilman Conway, you still on? Okay, he's not on.
I'm still here.
Okay, Councilman, from talking with the BPD folks offline, it seems to make sense to integrate that into your request. Are you good with that?
That's perfect.
Perfect. So, Councilwoman, we're doing gender and race add-on to Councilman Conway's request, right?
Yeah.
Nina, can you please update that to be a joint request from Conway and Ramos and reflect race and gender? Please and thanks. Back to you, Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. My second question has to do with nuisance properties. And I wondered, this actually was a conversation that came up with Major Leffler, and I'm so sorry that he left the Northeast, but I know he's doing good work now, and I'm happy with the new major that we have. The nuisance law says that you have that it doesn't kick in unless there are 2 instances of police activity at a property, commercial or residential, within 2 years. And given the musical chairs that our majors play and some of our other, impositions and things like that, it seems to me like it would be a good idea to start a database of some of the properties that you're tracking so that it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. Because he had suggested that, they had raided a place twice in 10 months, but he had been new and didn't know until somebody else, had remembered it. So my suggestion is so that we can be really clear about which are nuisance properties and things like that, and it's trackable, and you're working with communities on those to get a database together with those. Is that something that you can do, or I can work on with you?
I think that's something we can work on together. Some of what you're asking for probably already exists in CAD or the computer aided dispatch, but it may not be specific to a raid. There may be calls for service that we can certainly go back over periods of time to track a call for service. But if it's a self-generated activity like a raid, that might not exist in CAD. So there's opportunity for us to build it. Yeah.
Yeah, and sir, if I could, and council member, the new records management system will really help us with this. That tracks essentially every kind of interaction that we have, even things that aren't generated through the 911. And so those are all affiliated with some address location. And that can really help with that kind of centralizing of all of this data as you've described. It's one of the challenges we've had in the department, and with the new records management system coming online, could really be a game changer for what you're describing. And so we look forward to that being useful data for us to help us with that exact issue.
I think that's what I'm looking for. It doesn't necessarily have to be a raid, but where, residents constantly call about specific things happening, don't see things done. And it's important to keep track of all of that to see whether they actually comply with where we could kick in the nuisance law on some of that stuff. Right. So that's what I'm really talking about. So it sounds like the new records management system might actually help us with this.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll look forward to following up with you on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm good.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Council President Mosby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Commissioner, in line with my previous questions around overtime, I know that you've done a tremendous amount of improvements around, I guess, the take-home vehicle policy. I think you made some changes a couple years back. Could you talk about what was done there and where we currently stand with that?
Absolutely. We certainly realized that we had number one, we have three different types of vehicles: vehicles we own, vehicles we lease, and vehicles we rent. We early on partnered with what we call the Civic Innovators Project with experts from around the city to help us figure out how to better streamline our fleet processes. We did that. There were a lot of recommendations that came out of that last year, but we were already moving on our own to make sure we could have measures of accountability in our fleet in the distribution of cars, especially take-home cars, where we found a large number of individuals with take-home cars that did not have some type of assigned responsibility to have a take-home car, like callback responsibility or some emergency response responsibility. We, on our own, with our new protocols that we put in place, recalled a number of those cars and grounded many of those cars as we put protocols in place on who needed to have one of those cars, why they needed to have it, and what it should be used for. And so many of them got recalled and grounded, gave us better grips on who had them and for what purpose.
Do you know how much cost savings that attributed to?
Yes, Deputy Commissioner Gillis oversees the Administration Bureau, can speak to that briefly.
Hey, Mr. President, thank you for that question. And Mr. Commissioner, thank you for that explanation. Based on the data that we have been able to pull together for this hearing tonight, working with DGS, we just as an outset for the overall take-home car program, since we issued the grounding of them last year, we reduced the size of the fleet of take-home cars by 25% since about a year ago. That's for the entire agency. And then on average, generally speaking, the costs associated with take-home cars, just as an FYI, are a little bit skewed towards savings for people who are taking them because they're taking care of them better than they are if they're not taking them home. But just again, based on the data that we pulled together that we have right now, and we will continue to look at it more closely. It looks like it's about a total of $91,000 spent on fuel for take-home cars, and this is specifically for cars for people outside of Baltimore City, and about $242,000 on maintenance costs, again, for that same universe of cars for cars outside of the city.
Say outside, you mean officers that are assigned take-home cars but do not live in the city, right?
That's correct.
So we estimate that to be about $370,000 a year in maintenance as well as gas.
If you were to combine them together based on the data we were able to get in the last few hours since you made the request, in the last couple of days, excuse me.
Are any, with that new policy from a couple of years ago, did we put in criteria around miles outside of the city? Like, I think, if you live in Pennsylvania or Delaware.
Absolutely. And so there are two policies essentially that are in play. Well, there's three really. There's one that exists now, which we believe is not adequate for controlling the size of the fleet and administering it properly. And then there was what's called a police commissioner's memorandum that was issued this time last year, which was grounding the cars. And then we have been in the development of the draft newer take-home policy, implementing the Civic Innovators recommendations. And yes, to answer your question, Mr. President, there is a 40-mile radius from around the city that we are attempting to limit folks to.
And how do we follow up on compliance with that?
Well, we need to implement it, and then we need to enforce it. And obviously, what we don't want to do is cut our nose to spite our face, if you will, just because, as the commissioner said, all of this is based on operational need as opposed to, where someone is necessarily. And so doing an overall assessment of all of those cars in conjunction with the policy after it makes its way through the compliance process, which is working through the DOJ and the monitoring team, we will do a final evaluation and make sure that we are still having the operational capacity that we need, but also trying to fulfill some of these goals about whether it's geographic or local controls.
Now, when we talk about implementation, when do we expect that to occur?
That I would defer to Deputy Sullivan, but I would assume this would not necessarily take too long to get through the process of the consent decree process for policy drafting.
Deputy Sullivan, before you answer that question, just real quick with you, Gillis, the $330,000 that we put into maintenance as well as gas, how many cars is that?
That is 215 vehicles. And that's 186, 215 total. 186 is what that dollar figure is attributable to, sir.
Okay, and the delta between the 215 and 186 is what?
I would have to do math really quickly, but
No, not the number. I can do the number. I'm saying what's the difference between those? The 215 represents what, and the 186 represents what?
the 186 represents the total take-home fleet for folks who live outside of the city boundaries. And
Gotcha.
The 215 is the total size of the take-home fleet across the agency.
Oh, so sometimes, so that delta, sometimes it's like a flex.
Well, 284 was what it was this time last year, and it's shrunken to 215. So, and out of the 215, 186 is outside of the city, if that makes sense.
Understood. All right, so no longer, so we don't have to worry about the 215 number anymore. It's the 186. Got it. All right, Deputy Sullivan.
Yes, President. It will depend on whether the monitors and DOJ determine if this policy intersects with the consent decree. If it does, it will have to go through the entire consent decree process, and that could take several months. If it's determined not, it could very quickly be enacted. So we'll be engaged with the monitors and DOJ to make that determination on the policy.
Got it. I'm not sure if this is my last question, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if it's for the commissioner, Mr. Gillis, or one of the deputies, but has it ever been explored or the opportunity of moving BPD's fleet completely from an operation management perspective outside of BPD and just with DGS? Are there any operational type of concerns or problems there in doing so?
We've certainly had the conversation. I don't think there are any operational concerns. It's just a matter of management, fleet oversight, and making sure that there's communication, coordination, and collaboration between DGS and BPD to make sure that we're getting the vehicles we need and that they're being repaired in real time. Other than that, I don't see any operational problems.
And just to clarify, Council President, the cars that are owned by us are not owned by us; they're owned by DGS.
Yeah.
The leased and the rental vehicles, we are seeking to actively divest from those and go to a fully owned fleet. That is what's in the Civic Innovator report that was in partnership with the mayor's office and all those business leaders. We can forward that report to you, but that is the goal, to get out of the business of leasing and renting vehicles and go fully to the DGS solution of vehicles that are owned and operated through the city.
So basically, naturally, we're already moving in that direction.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and when you guys talk about, I guess the relationship between currently you and DGS, are there civilians that kind of represent the BPD side to help manage the program? Is that how that works?
Yes, sir.
And do you know how many civilians that equates to?
Mr. President, this is Jim Gillis. I believe there are 3 motor pool workers, and then we have a fleet manager civilian position that we used to have filled up until the end of the summer last summer, and we have a sergeant essentially filling in for that while we are hiring a new civilian into that role. So it would be a total, I believe, of 4. We will get you the exact staffing capacity for that.
All right. Thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, I do have just one question, I think, and I should be done. This is turning back to, I guess, the budget strictly, Mr. Commissioner. Service item 816, special operations section. I believe I heard you speak about this before, but the growth of 21 positions from this service contains specialized units, including special weapons and tactics, SWAT team, bomb unit, aviation, mobile met, K9, mounted unit, secondary employment.
I got this.
That growth of 21 positions.
Yeah, that's a reallocation.
Yeah, and where did it come from?
Yeah, so that's the mobile metro unit. We used to have that in police patrol as a service and activity. We moved it to better align it with what's actually in the operational control, and that's in the special operations section. So it used
What's
to
the name of that
report.
unit?
Yeah,
Eric?
so that's the mobile metro unit.
Oh, mobile metro unit.
That used to fall under the chief of patrol's office. It now falls under the special operations commander. So we moved it in the budget to reflect that operational change.
Is that the big Winnebago?
No, sir, that is not the big Winnebago. That is the mobile command center.
That seems like a cooler name for that, the mobile metro center.
But I think if the chief of patrol, Kevin Jones is online, Colonel, if you could explain a little bit about what the mobile metro unit does, that'd be helpful.
Copy, sir. So the mobile metro unit does, in reference to where they were best suited, does fall in the special operations section, not only with traffic, but outside of patrol, so we can use them as we see fit to deploy them to specific areas throughout the city where we are seeing either episodes of violence or areas are having high concentrations of handguns, and they're being very successful. Almost every weekend, at least several times a month, they are having car stops and interdictions where they're getting handgun violations. They're comprised of 1 lieutenant, 2 sergeants, and approximately 10 officers who are broken down into specific mobile units where that's what they do. They hit main thoroughfares within the city, within the micro zones. What they are specifically do is every day as they get deployed, we decide either east side, west side, what district will they be assigned to. It is their responsibility then to link up with the shift commander or the district commander to get specific directions on where they want them to be and what their mission is today, coupled with intel packets to assist them in their crime suppression activities.
Got it. Thank you. And then who are the other 8 officers or 8 positions in the total of 21?
So those are vacant positions that we're seeking to backfill. We see attrition in a number of our specialized units over time, and so as part of our staffing plan, we wanted to allocate opportunity for growth of those units to bring back folks. Some are promoted out of those positions. So those 8 positions are again part of the mobile metro unit. They're simply, kind of in places vacant positions for us to grow into.
So the mobile metro unit is a unit of 21, or is it a unit of 13?
It's a unit of 13 active members that I believe we have authorized strength for 21. So there's.
So the idea is that you'll be able to put folks in those vacancies, but they stay inside of that mobile metro unit.
Well, so we have a selection. Yeah, we have a selections process for that specialized unit, like we do all specialized units.
Yeah, but that specialized unit is to be outfitted with 21 folks. Is that right?
That's what the staffing plan in this budget calls for. That's right.
And that's not an increase. That increase of 8 is not an increase. We just reallocated and moved them from a different service.
That is correct.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're going to take a very brief recess in a moment, but first, I just want to quickly poll council members as to whether or not they have any further questions for BPD. Mr. President?
I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilwoman McCray?
No. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Schleifer. Thank you, Council Vice President Middleton.
I'm finished.
Thank you, Councilman Burnett.
I hate to be that guy, but I did have one more question.
Thank you. We'll get to you in 1 second. Councilman Dorsey.
Dunsky.
Councilman Conway.
Elfin.
Many ways to say it. Councilman Stokes.
Absolutely not.
Councilman Torrance. Councilman Cohen.
Hey, I have one more.
All right. Councilwoman Porter. Councilwoman Ramos.
I'm done, Mr. Chair. I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have Councilman Bullock on or Councilman Glover? Okay, we're not going to take that recess quite yet. We'll get through those last two questions and then we'll take a quick recess. Councilman Burnett, you're up first.
All right, rapid fire here. So when a case is declined, if there's a decline from the state's attorney's office to prosecute a case, does BP, like what happens from there? Does BPD convene with the SAOs to, you know, try to continue onward? Does the case remain open? Where does it go from there?
Well, thank you for that. What I can tell you, we have designed, gives me and gives us the information about specific cases, not all cases, like gun cases. And one of the main components we wanted to put in the crime plan was to be able to have an agreement to know which cases are declined on shootings and murders, robberies, and murders, shootings, and robberies, and handgun cases. And so through an MOU, an agreement that we have signed between the mayor's office, the state's attorney, and the police department, there is a report that gets generated in the early iterations, because we just kind of got started recently. We got one a couple of months ago, and it talked about, because there's an analyst that works over there that's producing that information about null pros cases on handguns, robberies, and shootings. So it's the number of cases and the aggregate data about those specific cases, but it doesn't go into great detail about what happens to, it doesn't go into any detail about what happens to the case thereafter, only that a particular case was null pros in one of those 4 categories.
Okay, so my follow-up was, is that tracked? Sounds like it is. And the reason I was asking that is that we know that there's a small number of individuals committing a lot of the crime. My curiosity was around if it's, the same, maybe somebody has multiple instances where they may be a suspect, but you don't have, for whatever reason, between the evidence available or the decision made in SO's office, it doesn't move forward. Just trying to figure out where do you continue to investigate, or is there a continued focus on that individual that maybe repeatedly isn't, cases aren't moving forward? I'm just trying to get, I don't know if I'm using the right terminology here, but I think you get where I'm going.
Yeah, I know where you're going, and the answer to that is yes. And I like Deputy Briscoe to talk about that, because she's been leading that meeting pretty regularly with the state's attorney's office, because the second component to having a report produced about null pros cases, so that we can know if the reasoning for that was on the BPD, so that we can self-correct. The only way to self-correct is to know what it is we did or did not do that caused that. But we wanted to have case file reviews on murder cases, shooting cases, robbery cases, handgun cases, and Deputy Commissioner Briscoe has been intricately involved in that with the state's attorney.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Harrison, and thank you for that question. It's a very good question, Councilman Burnett. And I'm going to assume you said cases that are being declined to charge, that we're talking about criminal cases, because I know there are various other types of cases. So I'm not speaking about criminal cases in this case, in this sense. So to the Commissioner's point, we do have an MOU where we collect aggregate data on our violent crimes with the state's attorney's office. We discuss those crimes, those cases monthly, like what's happening in them, and we look for patterns and trends, things that may inform our training, that may inform, in some instances, discipline. But where in every instance where she may decline to charge initially, there may be room for case strengthening, specifically like our handgun violation cases. I'll just use that for example. So if there's an instance where the state's attorney may initially decline to charge, we may come back with a to-do or a task list, some other things that we may need to follow up on to be able to strengthen that case. From that learning, we'll be able to see if there's anything that we need to inform our team with, whether that's going to be additional training, whether that's going to be some additional oversight or protocols to ensure that those impediments are not repeated. Now, where specific individuals are concerned that may be participants of violence, we're having that discussion as the initial arrest is made and that case is moving through. We're talking to the state's attorney's office. They're brought on board. Like, for instance, the case of homicide, the state's attorney works with our detective team from the initiation of that case. Same is so for non-fatal shootings and a few other offenses. So as the case is being worked, we're able to find out right away if there are any impediments that could prevent the case from being approved for charges once we get to a point of identifying a suspect, to minimize the risk of that case not being fully charged. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. I was just curious as to where it sort of what happens from there. Is that data something that could be shared, I guess, in the aggregate with the committee, with the council?
I think it's only for law enforcement use only, and it's built into the MOU that it was only for her to produce to us so that we can use to make sure we're course correcting when we find mistakes on our part.
That sounds right. Okay. I did have another question, Mr. Chair, but I'll email it. It's going to be a long one. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Cohen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you, Mr. Commissioner and staff. Mr. Commissioner, had a great meeting today with Bill Joyner and your team around the plan for equity, and appreciate the work that you all are doing in that direction. However, we're continuing to see just a unacceptable level of violence across the city. And so I'm curious, and I know this is a little bit of a theoretical question, but when do you feel like the plan in terms of violence reduction will really start to work and start to click? Because, again, and I know this is something of a national trend right now, but we are seeing a disturbingly high level of violence in our communities. And again, I give you a lot of credit for reining in overtime and I think working to implement the consent decree with true fidelity and hold officers accountable to it. But the violence in our city remains at a staggering level. So do you sort of see a time frame at which we will see a significant reduction in violence according to your plan?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I know what it takes for that to happen. It's really hard to answer that question in regards to a timeline. It really is about two things. We are transforming a police department in need of transformation and fixing all the things that have been pointed out that need correcting. But also there is a culture in the community that has to be transformed. And that's not always done by police alone. It is an entire culture that has been emboldened to, number one, bring guns into the city and then to illegally carry them, and then they're just brazen willingness to use them because of a number of reasons. They're, number one, believing that there are no consequences, and even for the consequences, for them not having fear of those consequences. And then COVID didn't do us any good. It didn't help us any. But it really has to have a transformation in the culture whereby we do two things. There has to be heavy enforcement for those extremely violent offenders who are doing violence, but then creating opportunities and options for them not to live that life of violence. And I see it happening when we begin to deliver on the promise of giving people options away from a life of violence, because enforcement alone doesn't change their decision to commit those bad acts. They have to have an alternative to making that decision, and they can't go look for it on their own. It has to be given to them. That's what this group violence reduction strategy and focused deterrence aims to do. It's about providing a pathway away from a life of violent crime, but also for those that are hell-bent on choosing a life of violent crime, then the full weight of local, state, and federal government is upon them to see to it that if violent crime is what they choose, then prison is going to be the price they pay. But we have to provide the options away from that. And in every city that has done it, this is how they have done it. Policing and deployment strategy alone does not do it. You have to be able to have programmatic solutions along with having really good policing services to offer opportunities. And you know what those you're smart, you know what those root causes are. And you have to, all of us have to work to fix all of that. and it takes time. So it would be really irresponsible of me to even answer that with a time, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. What's important is this administration, by the leadership of this mayor, is committed to doing the heavy lift of, number one, making sure we have a really good police department, but also making sure we change the dynamic in the community by which people make bad decisions to commit violent crime. And all too often, people are looking to ask the police about the issues of violent crime, but don't ask, well, why did that person commit that violent crime? We have to do both.
Couldn't agree more. Though your budget is substantially more than many of the other budgets that have to do with the root causes and supporting communities so that they don't turn to a life of crime. But all that said, again, Commissioner, appreciate all your work, appreciate your leadership, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councilman. We are going to go into recess until 11:05 p.m. Right now it's 10:58 p.m. We'll be back in session in 7 minutes. Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee. Before we reconvene, City Council Bill 21-0080, we are going to call to order Council Bill 21-0072, Local 911 Telephone Fee Revision. We held a hearing on this 2 weeks back. Is there a motion to move the bill favorably?
Motion to move the bill favorably.
Motion by McCray. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilman Schleifer. Costello is a yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Burnett's a yes. Dorsey?
Yes.
McCray?
Yes.
Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer?
Yes.
Stokes?
Yes.
This bill passes with 7 yeas, moves to second reader on Tuesday, June 8th at 2 p.m. We'll now call to order City Council Bill 21-0080, Ordinance of Estimates for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. Is there a motion to move the bill favorably?
Motion to move the bill favorably.
Motion by McCray. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Schleifer. Costello is a yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Dorsey?
Yes.
McCray?
Yes.
Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer?
Yes.
Stokes?
Yes.
This bill passes with 7 yeas and moves to second reader on Tuesday, June 8th at 2 p.m. We'll now call to order Mayor and City Council Resolution 21-0082, operating budget for the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. Is there a motion to move the bill favorably?
Motion to move the bill favorably.
Motion by McCray. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Schleifer. Costello is a yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Dorsey?
Yes.
McCray?
Yes.
Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer?
Yes.
Stokes?
Yes.
This bill passes with 7 yeas, moves to second reader on Tuesday, June 8th at 2 p.m. We'll now call to order Council Bill 21-0081, annual property tax for fiscal year 2022. Is there a motion to move the bill favorably?
Motion to move the bill favorably.
Motion by McCray.
Second.
Is there a second? Second by Councilman Schleifer. Costello is a yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Dorsey?
Yes.
McCray?
Yes.
Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer?
Yes.
Stokes?
Yes.
Thank you. This bill passes 7-0, moves to second reader on Tuesday, June 8th. Mr. Commissioner, I want to thank you and your team and members of the administration for being with us here late until the evening. Thank you very much. Committee is now in recess.
Thank you, sir.